Here.
Commissioner Lee,
Here.
Commissioner Ambrose,
Present.
and our newest member of the commission, Commissioner Fern Smith.
Here.
Thank you. Agenda item number 2 is public comment on matters appearing or not appearing on the agenda.
Good afternoon. I'm not sure if this is 2 minutes or 3 minutes. In front of me, 2 minutes.
It should be 3 minutes. We'll change that now.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Ellen Lee Zhao, ELLENLEEZHOU. I have been a public social worker for more than 10 years for public health. I am a SEIU 10-1 union bargaining team member for government employees. We have 16,000 members for government employees. I am also the Director of Public Relations for California Civic Grand Jury Association, the San Francisco chapter. I am here today as a former nonpartisan candidate running for mayor for the June 2018 election. I was discriminated because I was not a Democrat. I was not white. I was not black. I was not allowed to go in many of the debates and forums, and those took places in public places, such as the City Hall right here with televised programs, public libraries, public parks, and many other occasions like 401 Venice, South Venice. I have been coming here and ask you, ethics commissions, to do investigation to stop possible unfair election and possible election fraud. The last Republican mayor in San Francisco was 55 years ago. That was George Christopher. The last board of supervisor who is non-Democrat was 45 years ago. San Francisco, the electoral officers has been bought and paid by super PAC. The super PAC is controlled by people who have money. San Francisco should not and no longer for sale. But the Ethics Commission has to be on board and take care of the public. You are appointed here to stand up for the public. I believe the Ethics Commission has a duty to reform the city government, to create a balanced government by allowing the public form of government so that our social problems can solve effectively by a balanced government from different parties like Republican, Libertarian, nonpartisan, independent. We had 7 parties, but San Francisco has been ruling for the one party, single monarch party, Democrats who are paid by super PACs. I am here to ask you to stop corruption and to stop voting fraud that I have been reported to you for the last many meetings that I come in here. For the last many decades, San Francisco has been controlled and sold and bought. It's about time for you ethics commissions to stop corruption. You were created to stop election corruption and public electoral office corruption. And for the last many years, California has been controlled solely by many of the monarch parties, that is Democrats. San Francisco needs a balanced government from different parties. I urge you to do something so our government can be reformed and run a government by the people, but not by the few elites and who bought super PAC and paid for the electoral office to be in office.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry to be the correction, because you always do it on purpose. I've never said things the way that it was coded in minutes. I'm going to give it to them for correction.
Any other public comment? Okay. We'll move now to the consent calendar items, which are the draft minutes for the ethics commissions. Oh, okay.
Great. So I'm here to speak. I don't see it on the agenda, but I know there's a proposal to eviscerate the expenditure limits that public financing matching funds candidates currently must follow. Is that going to be heard today?
That will be agenda item number 8.
So I'm commenting on agenda item number 8 officially. And I'm a lifelong San Francisco resident, and I strongly oppose the option that would completely remove expenditure ceilings for publicly financed candidates the moment independent expenditures exceed a candidate's ceiling by any amount. So I'm here today to urge the Commission to reject Attachment 1 and to instead pass Attachment 2, but amended so as to only increase the ceilings incrementally by $25,000 or $50,000 at a time for supervisor races and $250,000 at a time for mayoral races instead of the enormous increments that are in the current Attachment 2 draft. The Commission must mend the limits, not end them. And this is my first time at an ethics meeting, but I also question the timing of this meeting on a Friday afternoon before a long weekend. Something so profoundly impactful as public financing is going to be discussed.
Our meetings are scheduled on the third Friday of each month, so
Okay,
it happened
I'm just
to fall.
questioning the timing of it before a holiday weekend on something as impactful as public financing limits. So just want to put that into the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comment?
Hi, Commissioners. My name is Edward Wright. I'm a legislative aide for Supervisor Gordon Marr, and I'm here to speak on his behalf. So, as was announced at the last...
I'm sorry, on whose behalf?
Supervisor Gordon Marr.
Okay.
So as Supervisor Marr announced at the last full Board of Supervisors meeting, he has been working on a set of proposals to reform the public financing system. We definitely appreciate the Commission's time and attention paid to looking at potential reforms to that system. And the Supervisor does have concerns with some of the proposals in front of the Commission today, in particular the proposal to completely lift the individual expenditure ceilings after they've been raised initially, and the proposal to move away from tracking contributions towards campaigns towards tracking expenditures for the purpose of IEC adjustments. He also wanted to let the Commission know that we do have a set of alternate proposals that we have prepared. I emailed them to the Commission before this meeting, and we are happy to consider them as amendments should any of these proposals move forward to the Board of Supervisors or to introduce it as freestanding legislation should they not. Thank
I
you.
have a question.
Yes, Commissioner, I have questions as well. So unfortunately, the ordinance that you sent over was not able to make it out to make the deadline for publication for agenda purposes here for the Commission. So I don't think that we will be able to discuss that in full as an agenda item. However, we do have a lot of procedural questions as well as substantive ones, and wanted to get better understanding from you about your supervisor's intentions with regard to the ordinance, just procedurally. Is this, Deputy City Attorney Shen, is this something we can engage in now, or should we wait until agenda item 8 is called?
It would be better to wait until agenda item number 8, since we are in public comment and this is not an agendized item.
Right. Okay. If we could hold off on having that conversation till agenda item number 8, it would be greatly appreciated.
Yes, and I will stick around until then. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. I recall reading a couple of days ago that there were 8 supervisors who were sponsors of that proposed ballot measure.
So there's actually two different things at question. One is a ballot measure that has been introduced to the ballot.
All right, I'm talking about the ballot measure.
So that
and sponsored by Peter Kane, John Gollinger, and others.
yes, so that is
How many supervisors are sponsors of that or authors?
there are currently 8 signatories on that.
All right.
That is separate from the
I know it's
proposals.
And did the board, the board meets on Tuesday, did it act on that to place it on the next municipal election ballot?
So that was not acted on at the Board of Supervisors meeting. It was filed with the Department of Elections.
Well, is it going to be acted on?
So I apologize if I could jump in. Again, we're still in a public comment item.
What?
We're still in a public comment item, and this matter has not been agendized for this commission meeting. Certainly, I believe Mr.
All right,
Wright
can
make
you,
himself available for any questions.
Can you stay until we reach number 8?
Yes, I'm happy to stay until we reach item number 8 on the agenda. I would note that the ballot measure being discussed right now is not a part of item number 8 on the agenda. It's a separate issue.
All right.
Okay. Any other public comment on agenda item number 2? Okay. Moving on to the consent calendar for agenda item number 3, draft minutes for the Ethics Commission's January 18, 2019 regular meeting. And agenda item number 4, proposed stipulation, decision, and order in the matter of Joseph Certain, Ethics Commission complaint number 1718-012.
On the minutes, Madam Chairwoman, on page 3, in the paragraph that begins, Chair Chu noted there was the word "not" should be inserted. And in the next line, I would recommend commas around the word "however." And then on page 4, paragraph that begins with Stephen Hill commented on problems, etc. The sentence in question is, he further stated that if candidates did not have to report their contributions in relation to the public financing system, that would diminish transparency in the election because it would require candidates to report, I think the word should be contributions, not contributes. And then on page 6, paragraph begins, Larry Bush urged that the commission consider adopting a policy regarding the Freedom of Information Act. Did he say Freedom of Information Act or Public Records Act? Freedom of Information Act is a federal statute. Anybody on staff answer that, or can we just leave it that you will verify?
We will be happy to confirm that, and if he did not say freedom of information, we will correct it to say public records.
All right, and then later on, next or 2 paragraphs down, Mr. Marsteller recommended federal legislation by a request to the Honorable Nancy Pelosi to include in the bankruptcy code a bar against discharging a debt arising from use of taxpayer funds or public financing in local and state jurisdictions. And I think after the word are in bankruptcy and there's no recourse for recovery of these documents, I was referring to Mr. Marsteller's recommendation, and then staff, I would insert staff stated it did not have time to do so. And then I stated, he stated he would draft such a letter to provide it to staff. And I can give you these insertions.
Okay.
And with those corrections, I'll move approval.
Okay, is there a second? We have to
Well,
take.
I guess we vote on the other items, too.
Well, as a procedural matter, Attorney Shen, could you review for us what the appropriate procedure would be to take these consent calendar items and taking public comment and voting?
Right. So since Commissioner Kopp has spoken specifically to item number 3, it's probably best to take them one at a time
Okay.
in terms of voting and public comment.
But in the absence of having any item taken off the consent calendar, is it possible to take public comment on all of the consent calendar items and then vote on all of them at the same time?
Right. So under the Ethics Commission's bylaws, either a member of the commission or a member of the public can sever any particular item. So if a member of the public did want to speak specifically to item number 3 or 4, they could separate it from the consent calendar as well.
Thank you. So we'll call for a public comment on agenda item number 3. There was, no, we still have a pending motion for approval of the minutes. We can do that at the end.
Oh, please.
No, was there a second? I didn't hear a second for the motion to approve the minutes, but we can. We went to the procedural and then didn't have time for a second. So is there a second on the motion to approve the minutes, and then we'll take public comment? There's a second. Thank you, from Commissioner Smith. Public comment, yes. Mr. Marsteller?
Regarding the idea of writing Ms. Pelosi about the essentially our problems with the bankruptcy law and how short-sighted it is regarding public financing, the thought is that with H.R. 1 before the Congress in such a robust and visible way, which is the major reform for essentially campaign finance and all other related ethics matters. It's a very large bill put forth by, I believe, Representative Sarbanes, son of Paul, who I used to work for, actually. In any event, that was my thinking, that Ms. Pelosi would be probably interested in amending the bill, H.R. 1, which she had helped craft, and adding at this timely phase this mechanism to make sure that the governments in the local level have the ability to recover lost funds that were absconded from the public finance campaign fund, which was the case in one particular instance in San Francisco in 2010, when I think about 68,000 or something was not recovered. So that was my thinking at the time. So I just wanted to add that postscript so that you know that I see the two issues as twins. So this is very timely, this letter we're going to send, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Charles Marsteller, former head of Common Cause with Friends of Ethics, and been following the commission for over 20 years.
Thank you. Any other public comment on agenda item number 3? Calling for public comment on agenda item number 4. Okay, there being none, is there a motion to approve agenda item number 4? Or do we need to? Also moved? Okay.
You want to go ahead and vote on agenda item?
Oh, okay, so agenda item number 3, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Agenda item number 3 is unanimously approved. Agenda item number 4, we had a motion, and I believe, was there a second to approve? There's a second to the proposed stipulation decision and order in the matter of Joseph Certain, Ethics Commission complaint number 1718-012. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, the motion is approved unanimously. Now, moving on to agenda item number 5 with
Sorry,
yes?
Chair Chu, did you have invite public comment on item number 4?
Yes.
You did?
And
Okay.
there was none, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Agenda item number 5, the presentation and possible action in acknowledgment of former commission member Paul A. Renne, whose full term on the commission concluded February 1st, 2019. Thank you, Paul, for coming. It's unusual to see you in the audience here as opposed to up here next to me. I wanted to thank you for your thoughtful leadership and steady analysis and insightful comments always on all the matters coming before us. And you are a great role model for me because you always sought to understand and to listen to all who came before us and to also all of us here on the commission. And it has been an incredible pleasure and a privilege to serve alongside you here on the San Francisco Ethics Commission. And I want to, on my own behalf, and not speak for the commission, but extend to you my heartfelt thanks and appreciation for all that you have done for me as a new commissioner, but more importantly for the city and people of San Francisco. And would invite
Chair Chu, thank you very much for those very kind words. And Commissioner Lee handed me this as she came in the door, so I will thank her as well. Let me just say that my first feeling is, why am I here? Because I no longer sit on this commission. But I appreciate your comments, and I want to say that probably the 3 most important things that happened while I was a commissioner, which had made the job so much easier. And the first was when we hired our present executive director, Leanne Pelham, who has made the job of a commissioner so much more, not necessarily easier, but so much more meaningful in terms of getting things accomplished. And the other 2 things were the 2 ballot measures that we put on, Proposition S and Proposition C and T, both of which I think are some steps forward. But as I said at the last meeting, my one wish as a commissioner, and I hope that the staff will pursue it, and I want to say the staff has been very cooperative, and Leanne has managed to put together a very professional staff, but that the attempt to try and limit independent expenditures and the impact that they're having on politics in this city and in the country. We didn't get it listed as a priority item. The staff has indicated that it has done some work on it. There is some proposed legislation that I would like to see continue forward. And I will say finally that I have complete confidence that the district attorney has appointed, on my recommendation, Judge Smith as a commissioner, and I think you'll find that she will be a more than worthy successor to me. So thank you very much. You don't have to have public comment on this agenda.
Oh, we absolutely are going to have a comment from commissioners as well as from the public, and we have a resolution to approve if the commissioners would so like to do so. Is now a good time? So I would like to read into the record a resolution of the San Francisco Ethics Commission. Whereas the people of the city and county of San Francisco have declared that public office is a public trust and that the proper operation of the government requires that public officers be independent, impartial, and responsible to the people. And whereas the Ethics Commission has been charged by San Franciscans to impartially and effectively administer and enforce the city's governmental ethics, campaign finance, and lobbying laws. And whereas Paul A. Renne has served with distinction as a member of the San Francisco Ethics Commission since he was first appointed in 2012. And whereas he was reappointed in 2013 to fulfill a 6-year term of office as an ethics commissioner, during which he was elected to serve as commission president in both 2015 and 2016. And whereas Commissioner Renne completed his full term of office on February 1st, 2019. Therefore, be it resolved on this 15th day of February 2019 that the San Francisco Ethics Commission acknowledges Paul A. Renne with appreciation for his distinguished service and leadership and with gratitude for his enduring commitment to integrity and accountability in San Francisco city government.
I would move approval.
Second.
I have a hearty second. Okay, I would love to take public comment. Oh, and also commissioners as well. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to overlook my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if I may add on to echo what you said about the commissioner, I had the privilege of serving alongside the other part of the dynamic duo of public service in San Francisco, Commissioner and former Police Commission President Louis Renne, and it was an honor for me to serve alongside with Commissioner Renne and this commission. Yes, he's also a role model for me, but one thing that I would always take from you is the open-mindedness that every time when you walk into this meeting room, your core principle has always been well-grounded, but you've always kept an open mind, looking for common ground to make sure that we come to a workable resolution for the best for San Franciscans, and especially for those who are less visible and less represented by the city. So for that, I thank you. And you are a role model not only for me, but for many public service members in this city. So thank you very much.
I'd like to just add something. I clearly have not had the privilege of serving on the commission with Paul Renne, but I have known him professionally for many years. I've been handed a very large pair of shoes to fill, and I don't know that I'll manage to do it, but I'll do my best. I may have to stuff them with socks occasionally to do that, but I consider it a privilege to follow you, and I thank you for the recommendation, and thank you for all you've done for this city.
Commissioner Ambrose.
I just wanted to, in the interest of brevity, because I always appreciated how clear your analysis was, how focused your comments, how you got to solutions, and I really appreciate the guidance that you provided to me as I learned the ways of the commission. So thank you very much, and best of luck to you.
Commissioner Kopp.
I associate myself with the remarks of my fellow commissioners and the words which give expression to our gratitude to Paul Renne, Esquire, for his service and his leadership, and with the hope that the matter of independent expenditures, which he raised last year, will be considered and acted upon by this commission.
And public comment?
I was just wondering what your shoe size is, but in any event, obviously, after serving a full term now, we've gotten to know each other pretty well. That's a long time. And it's a lot of meetings and hours. And I want to say that I, for one, personally will miss you, Mr. Renne, and your smile. You have a nice smile. I can see why Louise married you. But I was going to say that also that I'm sure your successor will do a very good job in filling your shoes, given her credentials, which are extraordinary. Our second judge on the commission is amazing. We've only had one before, and that was Judge Grant. So we'll miss you terribly, and I'm hoping that in some way or fashion we'll see you. Certainly, I think with the measure coming to the ballot this year by the board and Mr. Keene, it's Peter Keene, former chair, that we'll be seeing each other on the campaign trail, certainly this year. So it'll almost be like you haven't really left. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd just like to thank you, Mr. Ex-Commissioner Renne, for your service, and and as well as all of you. I mean, you're doing this as volunteers. You're doing this because you believe in the city and you believe in public participation and civic involvement. And I just really admire that spirit that all of you bring to this. And so, thank you for your service in doing that. It's an example for all San Franciscans to follow. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And so now we have, did we vote on the resolution yet? Did we vote on the resolution? I'm sorry, did we vote on the resolution yet?
I think we did.
Okay. So the resolution having passed unanimously, I now have this to present to you, Paul, as well as
More flowers? That was yesterday.
Silverite. Plaque that reads, "In gratitude for your leadership and enduring commitment to integrity and public service." So I will come down and give this to you. Okay. Agenda item number 6, the election of Ethics Commission officers for 2019.
Item 6.
Thank you, Commissioners. I apologize for that brief delay. In your packets is a brief memo that recaps the process the Commission has for the annual election of Commission officers. It provides some background from the bylaws, as well as the process that the Commission has used in the past. So we just wanted to provide that as a backstop for your proceeding today to determine who officers for the Commission will be in the coming year.
Okay, thank you. So per the process laid out in the bylaws, I will now open the nominations for chair. So any commissioner who wishes to nominate a candidate for chair will state the name of that person. And if that person agrees to run, the person is nominated.
I wish to nominate current chair, Chu, to be the next chair for the next year.
Thank you, Commissioner Lee. I do agree to run. Any other nominations? Okay. So now I'll call for public comment, after which time the nomination process will be closed. Public comment.
I'm confused. I stepped out in the hall a minute. Have nominations been made? Okay.
Well, yes. Yeah.
So right. I just wanted to say that I've always been inclined to see rotation among the members of the bench, so to speak. But I did think back to the fact that we'd elected Judge Grant twice in about 2000, 2001, 1999 or so, and I was there. And Judge Grant was not happy about it. I don't know if you know Judge Grant, but she made it clear that she wasn't thrilled to be renominated. And she said she wouldn't do it again, meaning a third term, and that this was her last time. Well, unfortunately, it was very much her last time because the new board came in and they misread the situation, unfortunately, and we found ourselves in the position of seeing that the Ethics Commission was fired in toto by the board in Prop E, which was later clearly considered unconstitutional in many respects, not so much the firing of the commission, but Judge Grant said this was the first job she's ever had that she was actually fired from, which I thought was a bizarre sequence of events. I had gone out and campaigned extremely robustly against this. As a former head of Common Cause, obviously, it's a terrible abuse of process. But I thought I would mention that because I was thinking about that, because we've never, with this one exception, elected a member twice. And I just thought I'd mention what happened to poor Judge Grant, because obviously that was not deserved. And she was still a senior judge on the bench, I think. Maybe not. Maybe she did have to go off at that point, but it was a tragedy. So in any event, congratulations on your renomination, and I assume.
Thank you. Any other public comment? There being none.
Call the roll.
Commissioner Ambrose?
I wanted to, for the record, I did look at the bylaws. The bylaws are very clear in saying that the chair can serve for 2 consecutive years, and I think I just heard that Commissioner Renne was chair in 2015 and 2016, so I assume that it is a tradition for, if the chair is willing to serve for them. And I would also note that Commissioner Chu, you haven't actually even served a full year because you stepped in right in the middle of or after February last year. So anyway, all that to say, I vote aye in favor of your assuming the responsibility again. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Lee? Oh, I'm sorry. Just to recap, we're doing a roll call on the question of the nomination of Commissioner Chair Chu to serve as chair for 1 year.
Yes.
Commissioner Smith?
Excuse me, my reading of the bylaws is also that the chair can serve, if she's willing, for 2 years, and having heard glowing comments about your chairmanship from former Commissioner Renne, whose judgment I have great faith in. I'm quite happy to go along with that. I hope you will continue to serve and would vote for that.
Commissioner Kopp
No.
and Commissioner Chu.
Yes.
With the votes of 4-1 with Commissioner Kopp in the dissent, the motion carries.
Thank you for your confidence in me, and I hope to serve to the best of my ability and to the betterment of the city and people of San Francisco. So agenda item number 7.
Vice Chair, nominations would
Oh, yes, I'm
in
so
order.
sorry. So now we have the nominations for vice chair. Any commissioner who wishes to nominate a candidate for vice chair will state the name of that person. And again, if that person agrees to one, then the person is nominated. Nominations for chair?
I would nominate Commissioner Kopp to serve as vice chair again, if he would gratefully accept.
I decline the nomination.
Okay.
I nominate Commissioner Yvonne Lee.
Commissioner Lee? Do you accept the nomination?
Pardon me?
Commissioner Lee, do you accept the nomination?
Thank you for your trust. Because of my continued personal issues, grieving for my lost one, I don't think I could devote that much time serving as the vice chair of this commission at this time.
Commissioner Ambrose?
But I would turn
I would
around
like
and
to-
nominate Commissioner Ambrose to be the vice chair.
Now I want to come back to Commissioner Kopp and say you do such an excellent job. You seriously
We
won't.
delay this one part of the nomination for another month.
So the question, I think, is for the deputy city attorney, is whether we need to resolve the vice chair role today, or if it could be deferred or put over to next month's meeting.
Excuse me, might I ask if it's permissible to ask Commissioner Kopp if he would reconsider his, you asked him already, okay, sorry.
Thank you, Your Honor. I will not.
All right.
And I would like to ask Commissioner Ambrose to reconsider.
I will say yes. I will consider accepting the post. I feel a little sort of new to the commission to be in that position, but under the circumstances, I think I would happily learn the responsibility.
Wonderful. Okay. Director Pelham, could you, let's see. So Commissioner Ambrose is now nominated, and since there are no further comments, nominations, we'll take public comment. Is there any public comment? Okay, there being no public comment, Director Pelham, could you please take a roll call vote?
Yes, on the question of the vice chair nomination of Commissioner Ambrose, Commissioner Lee?
Aye. I mean, yes.
Commissioner Lee votes aye. Commissioner Kopp?
No.
Commissioner Kopp votes no. Commissioner Chu?
Aye.
Commissioner Chu votes aye. Commissioner Smith?
Aye.
Commissioner Smith votes aye, and Commissioner Ambrose?
Aye.
Thank you. On a vote of 4-1, the motion carries for Vice Chair Mandros. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Agenda item number 7, informational presentation on Ethics Commission campaign disclosure dashboards.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Tyler Field. I'm an analyst with the Commission's Electronic Disclosure and Data Analysis Division, or EDDA. I'm here today to show you the campaign finance dashboards feature of our website. I'd be happy to take questions at the end of this short presentation. Because of changes to the campaign finance reform ordinance approved by this commission in 2015, every political advertisement in San Francisco is required to carry the phrase financial disclosures available at sfethics.org. I'm sure you've seen this message yourself on one of the many political mailings over the past year. The financial disclosures this message refers to come to the Ethics Commission as electronic filings. When people come to the website looking for these disclosures, they could go to our databases, search through PDF copies of paper forms, looking somewhat like this. In 2018, there were more than 2,000 filings from over 400 committees. People coming to the website are probably most interested in one of the 964 filings from one of the 105 committees formed for the 2018 elections. Those 964 filings represent 12,800 paper pages. If you're searching through paper pages, learning about campaign finance reform is not a simple task. The first thing you need to know is what a political committee is, which committee it is you're interested in, what that committee's ID number is, then which form to look at, which section of the form will tell you what you want to know, Schedule A, B1, C, F. And then if you want to learn about independent expenditures for that committee, you have a haystack of 750 more pages of a different form to look for a needle with your committee's ID number in it. Understanding campaign finance is clearly not simple. The dashboards on our website take away most of that complexity and present campaign finance information in an easy-to-understand fashion that presents standard views for quick answers to the most common questions. At the same time, they're interactive to allow people to dive into the information. These dashboards have become the primary way for the public to learn about campaign financing. Over the past year, this was the most popular function on our website. Our analytics show at least 31 separate news organizations have written articles linking back to these dashboards as the source for articles on campaign finance in San Francisco. Over the summer, Pat Ford from the Policy Division and I conducted several informational sessions with members of the public and the press on campaign finance and how to use the research tools that the Ethics Commission offers. I don't know that we can completely take all the credit for this, but it's clear that the press has come to rely on these to do their job. During the November election, the morning after a filing deadline, I was double-checking numbers, and I had not updated the dashboards until 10 a.m. Newspaper reporters already calling at 9 a.m. asking, when are the dashboards going to be updated? Keep in mind, the filing information that feeds these dashboards was already publicly available. The database of paper forms is updated in real time as the filings come in. The reason we've been able to create these and to go beyond what we've offered in past years is thanks to electronic filing and the technology infrastructure work that EDDA has been working on. Now I want to shift to the computer to demonstrate in real time what someone using this tool might be able to look for. Let's pretend I got a political ad in the mail and I saw a financial disclosures available message. I would come to the San Francisco Ethics Commission website, where I'm presented by a call to action to discover the money behind the campaigns. I'd click on this very inviting green button to view the dashboard and come to the landing page. Come to the landing page for the dashboards. This page shows contributions and expenditures for different political committees. Let's pretend I live in District 6 and I want to learn about District 6. Let's say the message in the mail that I got was from a supervisor campaign, and I want to learn about Board of Supervisor candidates. I'll use the filter on the side to limit the view to Board of Supervisors District 6 committees. Now I'm presented with 4 committees that are active in the Board of Supervisors for District 6. I can see by this green bar an easy representation of the contributions received by the committee, and by the blue bar, the expenditures the committee has made. I can see the 3 major candidates in this race: Matt Haney, Christine Johnson, and Sonia Traus. This pink bar underneath, showing miscellaneous increases to cash, is curious. I can see over here on the legend that miscellaneous increases to cash includes funds received from the public finance program. I'm interested in the public finance program, so I'll go to the public financing tab to learn more. I can see here from the chart on the left all the candidates who accepted or who are making use of the public financing program. I can see the candidate from my district, D6, Matt Haney, received $155,000. And I can see Christine Johnson, the other candidate from my district, received $125,000. On the chart on the right, I can see that Mr. Haney received 100% of what was available to him, and Ms. Johnson, 81%. This chart on the bottom shows an overview of the entire public financing program, and I can see the total amount of funds dispersed as a part of public financing was a little over 1.2 million. An important feature of the public financing is the individual expenditure ceilings. This tab may look familiar to you. The charts on this tab may look familiar to you as they were featured, versions of this was featured in the policy report from last month. During the election, these dashboards were updated daily, so this represented the best way to come and see what an individual candidate's expenditure ceiling was on any given day.
Excuse me, Mr. Tyler, so you're saying that the individual expenditure ceiling screen was updated daily? How about the previous page on the public financing,
Yes.
as well as the expenditures? So everything is updated daily when we get into the
Yes, ma'am.
last stage of the
I didn't emphasize that very often. These are updated daily with during the 90-day election period.
Okay.
Before the election. These are updated daily to maintain the most recent numbers. Third-party expenditures or independent expenditures are a very important part of the calculation for IECs, but they're very confusing to try to follow as a member of the public. Third-party expenditures are reported by the committee that makes the expenditure, but the public and everyone thinks of expenditures as from the perspective of the candidate that they're made on behalf of. Let's continue my thought experiment of being in District 6 and wanting to know more about D6. I'll limit the view on the left to show District 6. And now I can see third-party supportive and oppositional funds for each candidate. I can see the total amount of funds for the candidate and the number of third parties making expenditures. Over here on the right, I can mouse over and see names of the payers or the committee making those expenditures. And if I'm interested in a particular expenditure, I can click on the bar in the expenditure detail chart, hover over and see a little bit more information. Or if I want, I can click on the C-filing page, or C-filing link, and be directed to a PDF version of that filing. For just this district, there were 110 separate expenditures on 62 different reports. Keep in mind that I'm able to calculate those numbers with the benefit of hindsight. During the election, if I were interested in D6, I would have to look at every single IE filing that comes through the Ethics Commission. That is a total of 800 more pages of filings.
I'm sorry, Mr. Field, could you clarify that statement? So this is a retrospective view, so we can see where the money was coming from and which organizations were contributing to the campaigns. But in the moment, so on any given day in the last 90 days up to the election, when filings are made on a daily basis, what level of visibility or granularity does the public have on these dashboards? Like, what would we not be able to see, for example?
Yes, I should clarify that. Using these dashboards, you would be able to see all of the filings. I brought up the 800-page number to emphasize how if you were following these elections without these, if you were looking at each filing coming in, you'd have to look at 800 pages of filing.
Okay, so it is aggregated here.
Yes, yes. Another instance where you would have to, in the old way, look at every single filing come in is late contributions. Within that 90-day period, every contribution greater than $1,000 has to be reported to the Ethics Commission within 24 hours. Back when the Ethics Commission was accepting paper filings, the workload was so great that staff could not keep up with the volume. And so we would print out or have all the paper filings on hand. Interested persons and press would come into the offices, sit in the public room, and sort through stacks and stacks of papers. For the 2018 elections, that was over 500 filings, more than 800 pages. But using these dashboards, I can see the volume and total amount per day very easily. For instance, on October 6th, I can see the total number of contributions coming in that day were 6, and they amounted to a little over $1 million. Scrolling down, I can see that in the detail pane, Mark Benioff gave $1 million on that day. If I'm interested in this contribution, I can click, and similar to the third-party tab, I could click here to see the PDF representation of the filing. Or if I don't know who Mr. Benioff is, I could click on his name and automatically Google. I see a little Google profile. Here's a Wikipedia page and his Twitter page. This would be a great way to start to learn about contributors. Now, $1 million seems like a lot of money to me, so I'd be interested to see who else is supporting the committee that Mr. Benioff is supporting. I'll switch over to the contributions page, where I can investigate a particular committee. I happen to remember that it was Yes on C. And so I'll limit the images on the left to only include contributions to the committee, Our City, Our Home, Yes on C. And I'm presented with a list of contributors and the amount that they contributed. This is clearly a much simpler way of looking through paper filings to see the true source of funds behind a political committee. One last feature that I wanted to highlight. Let's say I remember there being a lot of news about ballot measure committees in the June 2018 election. I would like to know where all that money was coming from. I switched to the contributor locations tab, changed the filter to the June date, and then look at ballot measure committees. I can see clearly $20 million in aggregate spent on or given to committees formed for ballot measures. I can see 18% came from individuals, and I can see almost 3/4 came from outside of California. Where outside of California, I can use this map, and the color highlighting shows me North Carolina, a lot of money coming from North Carolina, some money coming from New York, and then a little money coming from California. Using the rest of the tools on this page, I could dive more into that, into those numbers to investigate more. That's the extent of what I wanted to show you today.
Excuse me, can I ask a question? Is there any way that you can find out if the donor has made other contributions during the same campaign cycle to other campaigns?
Yes, Commissioner. On the on that contributions page that is aggregating all contributions to those 105 committees that were formed to participate in the 2018 election. So if there was an individual who made contributions to more than one committee, their contributions would show up there. There's a shortcoming to that in that someone named John Smith or Joshua Smith and Josh Smith would show up as different contributors because they're string matched.
So is there a search field? And maybe this is another way of asking Commissioner Lee's question, because if you could pull that back up again, you can search by ballot measure, you can search by candidate, you could search by committee name. Is there a way to search by a contributor?
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am. If I go back, and I'll use Mr. Benioff as an example again.
Got it. Okay.
You can see here contributions to the yes on C, and then a different committee, yes on A. So you can see it's bringing in information from different committees. That was all I wanted to show you today, but I think you can get the most out of these by playing with them yourself. I encourage you all to click around and attempt to find interesting information. I wanted to reemphasize that the public and the reporters in San Francisco have come to rely on these as a source of information, and the Ethics Commission has accordingly started updating these, and that we update these on a daily basis, and that it has become a daily part of operations inside the Commission. Because we want to keep values current and make sure that accurate numbers are always available. We're working on building out the technical infrastructure that makes things like this possible. And so I look forward to bringing more projects like this to your attention in the future.
Mr. Field, thank you very much for this. I found that to be a very powerful presentation, and I think that the automation and the clear and easy to navigate presentation of all this complex data is incredibly important for the transparency in our elections, and it's really stunning to me to see laid out there in black and white or full color how much money is being spent in our elections, and it's shocking that $11 million is coming into our city from city elections from North Carolina. I mean, I never would have known that absent your dashboard. And so this goes to a budget question I think that Executive Director Pelham will address later, but do you currently have the resources that you need in order to continue this work and to maintain it and to continue to update it as we go forward?
I would defer the answer to that to the Executive Director Pelham. Hopefully she will let me know beforehand if the answer is no.
Well, certainly budget cuts for the commission budget in the upcoming year are we definitely do not and cannot let anything happen to the resources here. I think this is such a powerful tool for not just for us, but certainly for the public and especially for the voters to understand, where is the support coming from, and it is significant. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments from commissioners? No? Okay. Public comment? Mr. Marsteller.
Yes, for the record, Charles Marsteller again. I was wondering if the press in particular, but I guess members of the public have called in and tried to factor what percentage of an individual's contributions would constitute, say, total spending in a ballot measure race, so that you take Prop C, for example, and if you see Mr. Benioff, or just to pick a name, I should say, Mr. Smith was a major donor, then the press is able to quickly ascertain what percentage of total spending or fundraising was donated by that particular individual and constitutes what percentage of the total budget to date of the committee's spending or the committee's contributions, whatever you choose to look at. That was the question.
I would say currently you would, someone looking to answer that question would have to do a little bit of math on their own, but I appreciate the suggestion and will certainly take it into consideration for the next round for the upcoming elections.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Chu and members of the Commission. Welcome, Judge Smith. My name is John Gollinger. I'm a public interest lawyer, campaign finance advocate. I teach election law now at Golden Gate, and I've been coming before the Commission and to the department for about 2 decades, also as a campaign manager in many campaigns. I want to comment a couple things on the dashboard. Really appreciate the hard work of the staff and the dedication of the department to disclosure, which at minimum I do think is a vital function that both the public, the media, campaigns, and posterity will use. A couple of comments on the current system. One is, I'm someone who uses the Ethics Commission website and the disclosure literally every day during the campaign cycle, and sadly, often almost every day outside of the campaign cycle. I will say, in part, because I have not found that the dashboard is updated in a timely fashion, at least to me, a timely fashion is effectively immediately, because certainly during campaigns, every day, hour by hour during the heat of the election really does matter. So I have not found that I can be sure the dashboard is the most current information. So personally, I go to the original filings on the website and pull them down. The Benioff example, when I was telling reporters who were asking me about the money being spent on that campaign, I looked at the original filings and added it up myself. So I recognize the staff, I'm sure, is working hard, but I would encourage priority to update those as they come in effect, whenever possible. And maybe that's done, but that makes it something we can trust. Related, and this is related to what Commissioner Lee asked, the individual donor, I think the dashboard emphasizes the aggregate and the big picture, which is valuable for policy heads and those of us who care. But for voters, and I think reporters in the most part, and me personally, it's what the individual donors are buying with their money and what their motivation is that I care about. So I would encourage for making that dashboard truly more of a link to the individual donors. For example, you could take the information you have on the campaign finance tab and just simply insert tabs for the PDFs into the dashboard so that you could click on Mark Benioff on the dashboard, and you could make it easy for someone to download each of his filings rather than have to shift over to a different part of the website to see what he gave when and precisely how. So that might be a little technical, but I think you can cross-reference some of what you have and make it easier to find out what these donors are truly giving for. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Other public comment? All right. Agenda item number 8, discussion and possible action on draft ordinances regarding the public financing program.
Thank you, Chair Chu, Commissioners. My name is Pat Ford, Senior Policy Analyst. Agenda item 8 is the latest part of the Commission's review of the public financing program. I think for the benefit of the newest member of the Commission, I'd like to just briefly recap kind of the overall picture of what this review project entails and how this agenda item today fits into that larger context.
Thank you.
So beginning last summer, at the Commission's direction, staff initiated a review of the public financing program. Of course, this is the program by which candidates for Board of Supervisors or mayor are able to apply to receive city funds to use in running their campaigns. The project initially was in response to a series of appeals, concerns, high volume of questions that were coming in from candidates that centered around certain aspects of workability and effectiveness at a kind of more procedural level about the program. The candidates were finding certain aspects of it very challenging to understand and comply with, and in some instances, candidates were in fact unable to participate because they did not comply with certain aspects of the qualification requirements, sometimes unwittingly. And as you'll remember from last year, there were a series of appeals about that. So the first phase of the review the staff undertook starting last summer was to focus in on these particular aspects. And kind of the mantra or kind of lens that we were looking at is how can we make the program more effective, more workable, impose less of a compliance burden on candidates, unnecessary compliance burden, improve the program in that way without changing really the basic structure of the program, not getting into matching ratios and the amount of funding that candidates can get, et cetera, but looking at things that were kind of more procedural in nature. Kind of the benefits of that approach, for one, initially there was a hope that this piece could affect the November 2019 election, and a smaller in scope ordinance in theory is able to get through the commission more quickly. When it gets to the Board of Supervisors, it's a little bit more digestible, and the board and a committee of the board would be able to review it, understand it, and hopefully act on it more quickly. So that's kind of one benefit of that. Also, last year when staff were working with members of the board on the ACAO, the Anti-Corruption Accountability Ordinance, we heard from a lot of members of the board and their staff that they would much appreciate having smaller in scope ordinances, that a large comprehensive ordinance is very difficult for them to digest and understand. So they requested us in the future, when you bring these things, try and bring them in kind of in pieces that are conceptually tied together. So this kind of narrow scope was also in response to that. We thought that would be an effective way to proceed as well. So the second phase, which staff plans to begin basically when the first phase is done, would be looking at these more fundamental features of the program, like what kind of funding can candidates get once they qualify. So that would include what's the maximum level of funding that a candidate is eligible to receive, how do they receive it? Right now they receive it through an initial grant and subsequent matching funds. Another proposal is to use democracy vouchers, has been used in the city of Seattle. So looking at an approach like that, or even if the current approach is kept, what's the proper ratio for matching? Currently, it's 2-to-1 for the vast majority of the contributions, and then a brief 1-to-1 period following that. So I think we'd be looking at perhaps a higher matching ratio, whether that would be appropriate, how much that would cost, why we would do that, what the effects would be on campaigns. Other things to look at would be the qualification requirements. Candidates have to receive a certain aggregate total of contributions and a certain number of contributions. So there have to be a discrete number of contributors as well as a total, a sum of money that they raise from people in the city residents, and within a certain time window. It's 18 months before the election. So looking at that, is that the proper metric for assessing whether a candidate is viable, whether they're a serious candidate with community support that should be receiving funds under the program? So looking at that, and other basic features like what's the initial spending limit that should apply to a candidate, et cetera. So that brings me to what's before you under Agenda Item 8. So there are 3 ordinances attached to the brief memo and chart, and these ordinances reflect staff's recommendations that were originally contained in the report presented in October. That's when staff presented findings and recommendations from that review process that took place during the summer and early fall. Yeah, the 3 different ordinances are similar in 3 respects. They contain the same 3 changes that are enumerated there in the memo. They differ in how they would affect the mechanism for changing the spending limits that apply to candidates. So Attachment 1 would switch to a model where candidates are released from the spending limit at the time when an increase would first happen for them. Attachment 2 would maintain the incremental adjustment model, but use larger increments that we think are kind of the minimum increments in order to actually have a change in how many adjustments there would be. And then attachment 3 would not change the incremental adjustment model. It would keep it as is, and that would be an option the commission could take if you wanted to either not make any changes or to potentially consider such a change during that subsequent phase when we're going to be going back and looking at matching ratios and the model of funding, et cetera. So that was put there as kind of an alternate option if you don't want to make some of the changes that are recommended elsewhere here. So another option, though, I wanted to mention that's not in the memo, but I should make explicit as an option, is to not pass the kind of phase 1 ordinance right now. It would be an option for you also to roll this set of provisions into that second phase of review. Essentially, we're planning to initiate this review right now, the second part of the review, and you could essentially table these provisions, and then when staff comes back with recommendations from that second phase of the review, you could roll the first phase into it. So there are kind of some pros and cons of that approach. The cons would be going back to the reason initially why we did a narrower in scope ordinance. You would then have a bigger ordinance. So there may be issues then, again, with the ACAO of bringing that to the board in a large package, kind of the problems that go along with that, of it goes a little bit more slowly. Sometimes it's hard to take on multiple issues at once. And also, it would be much later in time. For one, staff would need the time to review the second phase changes, bring an ordinance to you. Certainly, you'd want to review those, discuss them. So you're talking about it leaving the commission potentially at a later time, going through the board at a later time. So the prospect of affecting the November 2019 election would almost certainly be off the table if that approach were taken. So those are kind of the cons of rolling these provisions into phase 2. The pros are that you only have one ordinance, so instead of having 2, you have 1. So if you were to approve an ordinance today, I would be then working with the board on that ordinance while then simultaneously working on the phase 2 review. We do have another person coming on board soon that Director Pelham will talk about, so that would be a factor, but there would be in a sense, kind of 2 balls in the air at once. So rolling them together into one would resolve that issue. Another thing to think about is that after the meeting materials for this meeting were published on Monday, legislation emerged from Supervisor Marr on Tuesday that you already briefly chatted with Mr. Wright about. And that ordinance essentially addresses the same topics that are the topics of this review, except it looks at both phases. It incorporates some of the more procedural kind of workability and effectiveness changes in the ordinances before you today, but it also makes or proposes to make a lot of the more substantive fundamental changes that we're planning to review in phase 2. So it would change the ratio of matching, it would change the amount of funds that candidates can receive under the program, et cetera. So suffice it to say that as far as we know, we'll hear from Supervisor Marr's office shortly, but right now it seems that ordinance is moving forward, they plan to move it forward with the board. So having one ordinance emerge from the commission that is similar in scope in terms of what provisions of the code are being changed, to have those kind of line up, there's value in that as well. So when you're kind of evaluating which approach to take, that kind of weighs on the pro side. If you were to send sort of a narrow in scope ordinance to the board, while the board already has sort of a broader scope ordinance, that could create, some confusion and which one's the right one, et cetera. So having at least 2 ordinances that are similar in scope could lend itself better to either combining them or choosing one to move forward with, et cetera. So I think with that, I would say, whichever option you choose, we're going to continue to engage with the stakeholders closely, as we have been during this whole process, engaging with the board and their staff. So with that, I would invite any questions that you have about the project or about these ordinances or any of the reports that have been presented as part of this project.
I have a question, if I might. I was very interested in the board's action and involvement or apparent involvement. Other than Supervisor Marr, did there seem to be a positive reaction on the board or the board getting involved in this particular subject?
So I have not heard from any other members of the board or their staff on this. I've only been in touch with Supervisor Marr's office.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy City Attorney Chen?
Yeah, I think I just briefly touch on two procedural notes for the benefit of the commission and for the public. So with respect to Supervisor Marr's ordinance, I just want to make it clear that it has not yet been introduced at the Board of Supervisors. Supervisor Marr had announced on Tuesday his intention to introduce it. Once it is formally introduced, I believe on the 26th of this month, it will be formally referred over here to the Ethics Commission for your consideration. Secondly, I just want to remind the commissioners, even though I know many of you are aware of this, is that there are special procedural requirements for amendments to this portion of the Campaign and Governmental Conduct Code. So for amendments to the city's campaign finance laws, this commission must approve them by a 4/5 vote. So 4 members need to approve it before it could go forward potentially to the board today. Thank you.
Okay. So when I have a question for the Deputy City Attorney Shen. So when the ordinance comes over, the Board of Supervisors will not have voted on it at that point, or they will have approved it?
That is correct. So in addition to the special procedural vote requirements, the supermajority vote requirements, those vote requirements are also need to operate in a certain sequence that the Ethics Commission needs to approve it, and then the board considers it and potentially approves it.
Okay.
As you may recall from last year, the joint meeting.
Yes. So we would then receive the ordinance from the Board of Supervisors and would require a 4/5 vote to approve it, and then it would go back to the Board of Supervisors for their supermajority vote.
Sure, but just to follow up on Judge Smith's point, which is, I think, a very excellent point to keep in mind, that doesn't preclude the staff from making informal sort of connections or initiating communications with the various supervisors' offices about what they'd be interested in supporting, things they'd like to address, various amendments they'd like to see. We can certainly do that on an informal basis before next month's meeting or at the Commission's direction.
But we could expect an ordinance to come our way from the Board of Supervisors from and after the February 26th meeting.
There is opportunity for a lot of informal dialogue too, though.
So that if, for example, we were then to taking the next step in the procedural analysis, if we were to act today to approve by 4/5 vote an ordinance encompassing some or all of the items proposed by staff, it would then go to the board, and it could be overlap or in conflict with what we would be receiving down the road from them.
Right. It could be like two ships passing the night.
And on the substantive question, Mr. Ford, could you just outline for us and let us know whether there are and how many, if so, points of in common that we have in our proposed ordinance in whatever shape or form, like being as inclusive as possible when held up against the proposed ordinance from Supervisor Marr?
Yeah, I think I know there's at least one or maybe two of the provisions that are in the ordinances before you that are also in the ordinance from Supervisor Marr.
Is there a history of the two staffs or the two groups working together informally or otherwise when there's an area of joint interest?
With members of the board generally, yes.
Okay.
With Supervisor Marr, no, only because he's brand new to the Board of Supervisors.
I know that feeling.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions from the commissioners? Commissioner Ambrose?
Deputy City Attorney Shen, just so I'm clear, if this commission were to forward a version of an ordinance to the board at the same time that Supervisor Marr's ordinance was forwarded to this commission, I'm assuming at that point it would be possible sending something back to the board for the issues to also be reconciled in a public hearing on the various points. And I guess what I'm really getting at, I think reading the material from the staff, based on the comments that we had at the last meeting, seeing the emails here, there are at least a few of the, I'd say, there's like maybe 4 different subject matters that you attempt to address. There's a couple more that I saw in Supervisor Marr's draft that he's adding to the debate. So wouldn't it be helpful if we at least had some feedback to you on where we think we're at on some of those individual items? I mean, I'm also open to just waiting to react to what they have, but I'm ready to plow through it if you wanted to take them sort of point by point.
I mean, through the chair, I think staff would find any direction from the commission helpful. I would leave that to you. Yeah.
Well, you know, I for one, I think that it would be helpful to me and for staff as well as the public to have a commission discussion on the proposals before us today, which we have had multiple meetings to discuss and are of great interest, I think, to the public, as well as to better understand from Supervisor Marr's office the timing and the intention and kind of procedurally, you know, what the expectation is and how we can work together going forward on a more comprehensive ordinance that would go back and forth between our 2 organizations. So what would be most helpful to have the procedural piece with Supervisor Marr first, I'm asking my fellow commissioners, or to have the substantive discussion on what's before us right now?
I would like to hear from Supervisor Marr's legislative aide, just so, since the draft was made available to us but not to everyone in the audience because of the timing, I think it would maybe inform the discussion if everybody heard what the legislation he's proposing to put on the table.
Great. Okay, let's do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Chu, and thank you, Commissioners. First, just to address, I think, some questions that have been raised in regards to process. In terms of our office's intention moving forward, we look forward to working with both the ethics staff and the Commission in reaching a more comprehensive conclusion to various proposals that are before you today and maybe before you in the future. In regards to what the next step might be for us, we indicated at the Board of Supervisors meeting on Tuesday that this is an issue we're committed to working on and to addressing. As to whether or not we move forward with introducing the ordinance itself on the 26th, I believe that's an open question dependent on what action the Commission takes today. If you do decide to move forward on some of the proposals here that take a narrower scope to some of the reforms, our office would be happy to consider looking at those and perhaps amending them when they come to the full board. And if you decide to not move forward with the proposals before you today, then we would likely move forward with introducing a more comprehensive ordinance at the next Board of Supervisors meeting.
Question.
Commissioner Cotton.
Do you know how many co-authors are likely?
We do not at this time.
Okay.
Once again, yeah, we have.
Answer. Thank you.
And just to clarify, the intent is to move forward legislatively as opposed to putting this on the ballot.
Yes.
So as if I understood what you just said, then if the Commission moves forward or does not move forward today, but moves forward on a narrow basis, then it's your supervisor may or may not consider proposing the legislation? Because as I understand, the scope of your legislation is much broader than anything that we're contemplating here today, because there are much more narrow provisions. So I'm not quite sure I understand if we do go forward with an ordinance today that you may not proceed? If you could just clarify that for me again.
Yeah, so it is our intention to proceed with bringing our proposals before the commission. The exact mechanism by which we do that, we're not trying to be prescriptive about, and it's dependent on what action you take today. So if you do move forward with some of the proposals before you, we may consider, depending on what the proposal is, introducing a separate ordinance that addresses only the items that are not included in that proposal. So in effect, leaving the phase one narrow scope ordinance as it is, and then introducing a separate ordinance looking at the more substantive changes that are not included in that. Or we may consider amending it to become a more comprehensive ordinance. But that entirely depends on the discussion and the actions that you choose to take today.
Okay, and then a second question I have is regards to timing. Was there any intention or desire to try and impact to get something passed and enacted before the November 2019 election?
That it's an open question. I think it would depend on what the scope of the ordinance or potential ordinances that come before the Board of Supervisors would be. For instance, I do think there would be value in a more narrow ordinance being passed with time to impact this November's election. We have not made a decision yet on the effective date if there were to be a more comprehensive ordinance with more substantive changes.
Right. Well, I think that just from a timing and a practical standpoint, that only a narrow ordinance, could be passed and enacted and implemented and communicated about effectively before the November election, which effectively would be June, because the filing deadline for candidates would be the beginning of June. So that doesn't leave a lot of time right now. So a more comprehensive ordinance would necessarily have to wait for next year.
Yes, I think that's likely.
Okay. Any other questions for? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners.
All right. So why don't we take up the proposal that Mr. Ford has presented to us. There's approach 1, 2, and 3 from staff, as well as approaches numbers 4 and 5 from members of the public. So Pat, if you could recap for us approach number 1, what it incorporates, what it includes and doesn't include.
No problem. I'll answer questions from here if that's okay.
Okay.
So just to be clear too, the different approaches only bear on the spending limit adjustment model. There are 3 other aspects of the ordinance that are the same between the 3 drafts that are in front of you. So regarding the spending limit, approach 1 is to release a candidate from his or her spending limit instead of incrementally adjusting the candidate's spending limits upwards. The second approach is to maintain the current model that we have, which I'm realizing now I should probably recap what the current model is for the benefit of the new commissioner and the public. So the current model is that any candidate who is qualified to receive public funding must agree to abide by a spending limit. Spending limits are something that cannot be imposed on all candidates. The Constitution prohibits that. However, it is something that can be a condition of a voluntary program like public financing. So that's why it's okay for that to be a part of the program. A unique feature to San Francisco's public financing program that doesn't exist in any other jurisdiction is that spending limit that a candidate agrees to must be incrementally adjusted upwards by the Ethics Commission based on the activity of opponents in that race. So there's a formula in the code that looks at basically 3 different factors. It looks at contributions that are received by an opponent. It looks at independent expenditures done to support that same opponent. And it looks at independent expenditures done to oppose the candidate who you are analyzing. So if I'm the candidate, independent expenditures against me, and then independent expenditures for my opponent, and then contributions received by my opponent. You take the sum of those three figures, which the intent is to try and make a sum that shows kind of the total amount of funds that that candidate is up against, and then incrementally adjust that candidate's spending limit to that total, with the idea being that you should allow the candidate the opportunity to respond with the same amount of funds that are being spent basically against him or her or for that opponent. There's a minimum increment by which the spending limit can be raised. So right now it's $10,000 for supervisorial candidates, $100,000 for mayoral candidates. It doesn't mean that we always raise it by that increment, but it means that we have to raise it by at least that increment. So for example, oftentimes we'll make a $50,000 adjustment to a supervisorial candidate's spending limit because we might get a 496, which discloses independent expenditures during the 90 days before the election, and that might disclose $50,000 of IEs done against that candidate. That could cause us to raise that candidate's spending limit $50,000 at a time. So it really fluctuates what the size is of a spending limit adjustment, but it has to be at least $10,000, and then it's done in $10,000 increments. So we can do it by $10,000, or $20,000, $30,000, et cetera. So that's kind of the current approach in a nutshell. So to go back, the three approaches that are before you, one is to basically not do these incremental adjustments. As I mentioned, this is the only program that does this. Other programs either don't release candidates in any way, they just hold them to that spending limit. That's more common in full public financing programs where once a candidate qualifies and gets funds, they don't raise or spend any more private money. That's not what we have here. We have a partial public financing program where candidates are still allowed to raise, in fact must raise, private contributions in order to get additional public funds, and they're allowed to spend a certain portion of those privately raised contributions. So anyway, so that's one approach that some jurisdictions have. Never increase or release a candidate. Other jurisdictions do a release, which is what this approach shows. And that basically says once that formula that measures opponent activity adds up to a number that's more than that candidate's spending limit, you say, okay, that candidate can now respond, and that candidate's not subject to a spending limit. But only once that figure hits that amount do you release them. Up until that time, they're still held to that initial spending limit. So that's kind of approach one here. That's in attachment one. Another approach, approach two, that's in attachment two, is to maintain the basis of the current model, this incremental adjustment model, but to change the minimum increments by which staff must raise the spending limit. So I mentioned that right now it's 10,000, but sometimes we can raise it, or we must raise it in greater amounts based on activity. This would say that in order to adjust it, we must adjust it in increments of $100,000 at a time. And basically, a rough estimate is that this would cut in half the number of times that spending limits are adjusted. I have a figure in here in the January report about how many times it was adjusted, spending limits were adjusted. It was over 100 times during the elections. So raising it to $100,000 would cut it in about half. You might think it would cut it down to 1/10 since we would be having a 10 times larger increment. That's not the case because of what I was saying about sometimes we have to raise it in bigger chunks. If there's a $50,000 IE, we raise it $50,000. So $100,000 is kind of the threshold where you would actually see an appreciable change. Anything less than that, you might have one or two fewer spending limit adjustments, but not much. It's pretty much going to look the same. So this is an approach to keep the current model, but do a little bit fewer in number adjustments, but you still get to the same place. So you would remember the chart that Mr. Field showed you of spending limit increases that kind of looks like a staircase that goes up over time. This approach would keep that staircase, and it would rise to the same point, the same height, at the same time, but you would see fewer stairs, and the stairs would be bigger. So that's essentially what approach two is.
Well, because you're going to go on and talk about the other pieces. And I think this particular subject is very much the focus of the discussion that we'll hear when we get to public comment. So just to be clear, if you don't go with just eliminating the cap altogether once the IEC is exceeded, your second proposal would be to increase it for the Board of Supervisors by $100,000 increments, for the mayor's race by $500,000 increments. And from what I recall seeing in the draft legislation from Supervisor Marr's office, at this time, their proposal was to increase it by, for the board candidates, $30,000 at a time, for the mayor, $250,000 at a time. And then in the commentary that we've received in the emails, I've seen people for the board somewhere between 25 and 50, and for the mayor, they also seem to think that 250,000 is the largest increment. And then back to your point, going back to the charts, your report to the commission is that if the incremental, if the cap is only increased by 30,000 for board candidates, you will continue to do, you said you had to change it 100 times when it was at 10,000, and you think now you'd have to still do it 80 times or something more than half, less than 100%?
That's correct. Probably closer to 100. Yeah.
Okay. And that, to me, was the problem that we were initially trying to address, is trying to streamline that exercise so that we could make it easier for the candidate committees, for one, to have some predictability about what was happening on a day-to-day basis, making less use of our staff time during the election periods, adjusting the expenditure cap. And have you shared your analysis of what would have happened in 2018 with these other limits? Because I think everybody is seemingly sensitive to the idea of adjusting the cap. I just would say, for my own part, I'm not interested in eliminating it altogether. I think that there were some arguments about how it would work during the process of a campaign to have the potential of spending limits continue to be enforced throughout the course of the campaign. But I am concerned about just having just making a minor change in the amount and not really affecting the process at all, because the money's coming in a lot faster than $30,000 a day or whatever in a couple of days' time. Anyway, that just, maybe we should go to...
No, I would agree with you in that if we're going to address the problem, which is that the multiple and adjustments over a compressed time period and press releases and on a $10,000 increment, and if the solution doesn't improve the problem very much, then it's not really much of a solution, right? So is what I'm hearing. So it's like, and I don't know is it 30,000, 50,000, 100,000, what's the right number? And that's where I think that analysis and data are very, very helpful to understand, like, what would the impact be of these changes? Because we can pick a number that says 30,000 because it sounds good. It's 3 times 10,000. But until you model it out and know that when a candidate had 25 increases at 30,000, it would be 22 increases. Well, that's really not much of an improvement. But if it's at 50,000 that drops to 16 increases or 14 increases, well, then you're starting to talk about a difference that makes a difference. So I think that the analysis from my perspective, I know I've said this before, but data and facts can be very, very helpful to inform the policy discussion.
Yeah, and those are definitely things we can bring. I did not include those with the January report for the purpose of brevity. I have looked at these. That's how I arrived at the $100,000 number. That's something that gets you to about 50 or 60% of the number of increases, roughly. So, like, for example, in District 2, Catherine Stephanie had 10 adjustments to her spending limit using that $10,000 minimum increment. If there had been a $50,000 minimum increment, she would have had 8 adjustments. And with a $100,000 minimum increment, 6 adjustments. And that's kind of what you see generally with candidates who have significant rise in their spending limits. For candidates who never really get that high with their spending limits, the difference is less pronounced. But with the ones that go really high, like with District 2, those spending limits reached $1 million. Starting at $250,000, they reached $1 million. This is basically how it would work with.
So I'm sorry, Mr. Ford, could you repeat that? So at the 10,000, like the current threshold, which is $10,000, she had 10 adjustments.
Correct.
At 50,000, she would have had
8
adjustments, and at 100,000, she would have had
6.
So at 30,000, she would have had between 8 and 10.
At 30,
right?
that's correct. It probably
So
9. I would guess 8 or 9. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Sure.
Can you, though, just for my education, you just said for somebody who raised considerably less money than that particular candidate, there would be fewer adjustments.
Sure.
So you're really, we're addressing the, whatever, the, in terms of your calculations, it really is these top fundraisers or people who have large opposition.
Sure. So I can clarify what I'm trying to describe here, which is that the effect is less pronounced, the difference between $50,000 and $100,000 increment, less pronounced for candidates whose spending limits are raised very high, meaning for candidates who are not facing a candidate who has so much support that it's raising the candidate's spending limit very high. I think maybe an example is more helpful. So in District 4, Gordon Marr had 16 adjustments to his spending limit. Jessica Ho had 12. Gordon Marr's spending limit was raised to a much higher level than Jessica Ho's because Jessica Ho had a much higher level of supportive funds. There were a lot of independent expenditures done in her support. That raised Mr. Marr's spending limit quite high. On the other hand, Mr. Marr did not have a lot of independent expenditures done in his favor, so that did not raise Ms. Ho's spending limit very high. Hers was raised. It was raised 12 times, but not as much. A lot of times it was being raised in $10,000 increments, $20,000 increments, as support for Mr. Marr grew at a little bit slower pace. So it raised Ms. Ho's spending limit at a little bit slower pace. They kind of mirror the opponent's rate of supportive funds. So again, so he had 16 adjustments. She had 12 using the $10,000 minimum increment. If you were to use a $50,000 increment, he would have had 12. Instead of 16, he would have had 12. And Ho would have had 4 instead of 12. So a big drop there. But then when you go to a $100,000 increment, Marr goes down from 16 adjustments to 7 adjustments, and Ho goes down to 2 adjustments because her spending limit was not raised much more than $20,000 ever. Or sorry, $200,000 ever. So 2 increments would have done it. That would have been her full increase. Whereas with Mr. Marr, so again, it's 16 under the current approach, 12 using a $50,000 increment, 7 using a $100,000 increment.
I guess my concern and interest is how is this going to impact the community-centered candidate versus the well-sourced candidate? I'm still confused with your explanation is if someone is well financed by independent expenditure committees financing, it would not help them if we have incremental increases using the Ho versus Ma scenario.
Right.
But
So
the question is, if I were a community-centered candidate who's having a hard time raising money compared to the better financed candidate, an incremental increase would have helped me. That's how I read this. So instead of a 10,000 or 100,000, if I were to do a 35 or 50, incremental increase, that would help me as a community-centered candidate, right? That's also bared out under the Mar scenario.
So the larger increments will help those candidates insofar as the candidates have raised the funds at that level. So increasing a candidate's spending limit from one level to the next really doesn't help them at all if they don't have that much money. So if we can use these candidates again, if Jessica Ho has a spending limit of $350,000 at that moment, but she only has $200,000 that she's ever raised, and then her spending limit goes up, it doesn't affect her at that time. It might affect her down the road if she raises the money. But if the candidate does have the money and they're currently being held back, their spending's being held back by their spending limit, then certainly having a larger increment would allow them to spend that money at that time. Does that answer your question?
So put it another way, so that if there was, if I recall correctly, in District 2, Stefani was a candidate, and that she did not have the same kind of funds that her opponent did, but because her opponent had so much money, her spending limit was raised. So she had the ability to spend, even though she didn't have the funds, the actual dollars in her account to spend, but she could go out and raise more funds, and she did participate in the public financing program to be able to do that. And so I think that for candidates who are, a grassroots or a more community-based candidate, raising, and it would be great to get feedback from in public comment on this with people with actual experience in this area, raising the spending limit in larger increments, I think gives more headroom for the expenditures to occur, as opposed to having to wait until it goes up 10,000 today, 10,000 tomorrow, another 10,000 on Friday, and then 10,000 next week. And so there could be 8 raises, in a 3-day time frame.
That's correct. I think maybe a better example than District 4 might be District 6, because in that race, Matt Haney actually did have funds he had raised that was right up to his spending limit. So he was very close to it throughout much of the race. I think I included the chart for him. I'm pretty certain I did in the January report that showed his funds and his spending limit. And there were a few times he actually had more funds than the spending limit. Most of the time he didn't, but at all times he was quite close. So under this approach, having the larger increment increases would do what Chair Chu mentioned, that there would, at most times, there would be more headroom. So it would give him a little bit more space because it would go up in bigger increments. So he would be able to raise more funds, spend more in those increments in theory.
I agree that the current 10,000 increment is not that workable for all parties, including the staff and the campaigns. My question is, if we were to go with this approach of raising it to $100,000 from 10,000 to 100, that's a pretty steep climb. How is that going to affect for me, my concern is the community-based, community-centered candidate. If we were to jump from 10,000 to 100,000, how is that going to impact? I understand about the raising the money, but it's really hard for community candidates to raise money. So if we were to do the 100,000 increment, for me, my understanding is a steeper hill to climb. But if we were to do it in the 30, 35, 50, whatever case scenario is, it makes I think it gives it more competitiveness for that candidate to raise money, isn't it?
Maybe I should clarify that the spending limits are changed on a per candidate basis. So if that community-based candidate experiences a $100,000 increase, it's not necessarily the case that at that same moment a more well-funded or not community-based candidate would simultaneously be getting an increase. So that other candidate would only get an increase if the candidate that we're focusing on, the community-based candidate, had total supportive funds. that reached that level to warrant the increase for that other candidate. So if you have a race between two candidates, one has a lot of monetary support, one is more grassroots and is relying on small contributions, and they're the only two candidates in the race, and they're both publicly financed. That other candidate that's getting all that big money support would not get any increase until the smaller candidate's activity reached that level that it warranted the increase. So you could have that small candidate getting spending limit increases and the other candidate not getting any. And that's kind of, in a way, what happened with District 4. Although both candidates ended up getting a lot of increases, Gordon Marr got very large increases. His spending limit was raised to a very high level. I want to say that it was up $800,000, $900,000, whereas Jessica Ho's never got that close. It was down at like $400,000 or something.
Well, the reality is if the candidate is better connected to potential financing, that person is always going to be, in a better position than a community-based.
Right, from a fund standpoint, but because those funds, that high level of funds for the candidate would increase the amount that the community candidate could spend, and so a higher increase gives that community-based candidate more opportunity to go out and fundraise and be able to spend more money. So I think that, $10,000, I think everyone agrees is too low. $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 gives that community candidate more room to be able to go out and get more contributions.
Because also right now we often do raise spending limits $30,000, $40,000 at a time. That happens all the time for supervisorial candidates included. Sometimes we'll raise it $100,000 at a time for a supervisorial candidate. It all depends on what the filings say that are coming in. So we might get an IE for a candidate that's $100,000, and that warrants an instant $100,000 increase for the other opponents. That can happen. But this would basically just say we're not going to do it an increase down at that $10,000 level. We're only going to do it at that $100,000 and $100,000 chunks at least.
And if I could just respond as well, Commissioner Lee, I think one of the difficulties that we're all facing with this is remembering that this is one piece of an entire program that's voluntary. And so not only pegging that sort of perfect spot or the better spot for this particular mechanism, we're really trying to step back a bit and encourage candidates to participate in the program in ways that they don't have unnecessary compliance burdens. And so I think it's finding that right balance. But we do know that the city and candidates and voters don't benefit from the program unless candidates participate. I think we're looking for something that could be an improvement for candidates in terms of relieving them from some unnecessary burden while also providing a benefit that makes some sense. And so I think that just drawing back and looking at the time that it takes for candidates to comply, that for the less resourced community candidate, it may be advantageous to have less undue burdens to have to comply with, so that it frees them up to be able to engage and spend the money that they have as a public financing participant. So this is a difficult balancing act, I recognize, but I wanted to just draw back to the larger picture of making the program appealing for candidates so that they participate and that voters get the benefit of their participation in the first place is one of the key goals.
Well, I think that there's really, I don't see much appetite to support lifting the cap completely, but I'm still trying to understand the difference between the proposed, not cap, but lift at 100 versus something lower that I've been hearing from the public, that's all.
Might I follow up on that issue? Because I've been troubled by some of the same things, and I agree with both Commissioner Lee and Commissioner Ambrose that lifting the caps completely I find troublesome and with unknown repercussions. And so I am not in favor of that, and I understand the problem with the $10,000 increments. Let's assume, however, that we raise the increment to, say, 50 and 250, 50 for the supervisors and 250 for the mayor, just as an example. And after one or two elections, it was discovered that there's still too much administrative complications, et cetera. It's still troublesome. But that's the only issue that's that needs to be tinkered with. How much effort or how much problem would it cost then to go from 50, 250 to 100, 350? You know what I'm saying? If that's the only tinkering you were trying to do, is that a big deal? I mean, right now we're talking about a number of things. We're talking about expenditures versus contributions and the increments and the separate bank accounts. But if we were only talking about the increments, would that be an unusual or unreasonable burden either on the staff or on the public or on the candidates? Taking a more moderate step now and basically seeing what happened.
It's hard to say how difficult it would be that the subsequent ordinance. If I had to guess, I would say probably similar to this one, only because the changes are the same change.
Mm-hmm.
So I would guess that the process would resemble this one. But I guess my thinking is that if you don't feel comfortable making a change that would have an appreciable impact at this time, which we can pretty much tell that a $50,000 increment would not really have an appreciable impact on the overall number.
Would
not have an appreciable impact. I think that staff would advise you not to change it at all. Only because, I mean, for one, just the general idea of not changing it, not changing the code unless you're confident that it's going to, have an appreciable impact to address an identified issue. It's best to leave it untouched. And then also, I think that it might actually be hard to go back later and do it again, because it's kind of like, well, the commission already acted. They did what they thought needed to be done then. Why change it again so soon? I think that's probably what you would hear from the public and from the members of the board. They would say, well, you just did it. Why don't you just, let that go for a while and see what happens? I would encourage you to kind of find what you think is that right approach now to make the proper change, and go for it. But I think in that neighborhood of $50,000, it just wouldn't have that impact that would address the issue. So we would recommend against doing that.
Thank you.
So Pat, could you talk a little bit about how mechanically it would work to get a $50,000, whether it's a $50,000, $30,000, $100,000 raise of the ceiling? Does the candidate have to have up to like $101,000, or how would it actually apply in real life?
Right. So that's another change that would be done by approach 2 in attachment 2, is that no, the candidate would not have to wait until total supported funds were $100,001 above their spending limit. That's what we do right now. So under the current approach, it's a minimum of $10,000 increment. That means that the formula, the total supported funds of the opponent plus IEs against the candidate, has to add up to a number that is more than $10,000 greater than the candidate's current spending limit. In other words, if my spending limit right now is $250,000, if that formula adds up to $255,000, I do not get an increase. I only get an increase once it adds up to more than $260,000. So, for example, my opponent has had $260,000 of IEs done in their favor. Or usually it's some combination of IEs and fundraising by the candidate. But I think you get the point that it has to be that your opponent has to surpass the level that you're going to be raised to before you get raised to it. In discussions with stakeholders, we identified kind of an issue with keeping that approach with a larger increment, which is that, let's say you were to use a $100,000 increment, you're now forcing that candidate to wait even longer to get a spending limit increase, even though there's lots of opponent activity going on. So if under the current approach, let's say my spending limit would be raised on October 1st to $260,000. If we used a $100,000 increment and didn't change how we adjust it, that means you might be waiting until October 15th to get raised up to $350,000, and that's a long time for the candidate to be held. So instead, what this would do is, as soon as that opponent activity exceeds the candidate spending limit at all, you give them that bump. You do the adjustment at that time, instead of waiting until opponent activity reaches that level. So that is another change, and that's how it would work, is you kind of do the change first as soon as it's warranted instead of waiting.
Got it. Okay, and then I think my fellow commissioners have commented on the concept of the release. And just as Commissioner Kopp had asked, to recap, the jurisdictions that do have a release are Los Angeles, New York, Oakland, and Long Beach. Is that right? Well, there's no formal mechanism for releasing candidates from spending limits. And then Berkeley and Richmond don't have a spending limit for publicly financed candidates at all. So
Correct.
there would
Yeah.
be no
So
release.
that is on page 4 of agenda item 8, and this was correct a request from Commissioner Kropp to list the California cities that have a public financing program and specify how these operate. So San Francisco is the only city that does this incremental increase in California. And then Los Angeles does a release. Oakland does a release. And then Long Beach does not have a formal mechanism for releasing candidates, but my understanding from speaking to staff there is that the penalty for going over your spending limit is that you can't get any more funds. So candidates can effectively opt out of the program, spend beyond the limit. So I don't want to say that it operates like a release because that's not documented, but my understanding is that's kind of how it goes. And then Berkeley and Richmond do not have spending limits that they impose on publicly financed candidates. So that's a kind of a brief survey of California cities. You did mention New York. New York has, I guess, kind of a hybrid model. They do 50% increase. So as soon as opponent, I think they use spending, if I remember correctly, but as soon as opponent spending reaches 75% of the candidate spending limit, then the candidate spending limit is increased to 150% of the initial limit. So if you're starting with a, $500,000 limit, then your opponent spending reaches, what is that, 325 or something, then you get raised to 750. Then if your opponent spending reaches 750, then you're released. So they basically do one big adjustment and then a release. So that's the New York model. And I think that's a unique model. I'm not aware of another jurisdiction that uses that.
Okay. Well, I am. I share my fellow commissioners' concern about doing a release because I think that your analysis showed that the release would have. It would not have had an impact. They wouldn't have reached the spending limits. But I think that the behavior is what is would change the behavior of how candidates would raise money and spend money. Is what we heard from public comment, and so that the underlying assumptions that would drive the trend line of spend, I think, would change if there were no limit at the very end. If they knew that they could reach that magic ceiling and then it would disappear, then all of the funds could start to flow. So that would be a concern that I would have with releasing, doing a release in that manner. So that was your proposal number 1, was to offer a release. Proposal number 2 would be to have the $100,000 and the $500,000, and proposal 3 would be to just leave it as it is.
That's correct.
Current program.
That's correct. And then also I want to highlight on the table that starts on page 5 of agenda item 8. Those are laid out. Brief title, description, and then kind of evaluating the potential impact, looking at sort of candidate compliance, participation rates, and then the impact on the IEC provision. And then I also included 2 suggestions that we received through public comment. Those suggestions could be done in combination with 1 through 3. 1 through 3 kind of are mutually exclusive. You kind of have to pick one. They're, I guess I should say, they're inconsistent with each other. So you'd want to pick 1, 2, or 3 if you're going to pick one. But 4 or 5 could be added on to those. They're a little bit different. They focus on the IEC, on the spending limit, but kind of different aspects. So those are in there as well. But just wanted to point out that they could be done in isolation.
Well, I think that proposals 4 and 5 to me are, much more substantive than eliminating the trust account or the increasing the stair step, and I had thought in my mind would be considered as part of a phase 2 on a more comprehensive approach, raising the initial spending limits as well as taking a look in proposal 4 for the IE funding. So I would be inclined to take up those topics in a more broad discussion of the overall more comprehensive ordinance in a phase 2, which is upon us, I think, in the coming meeting. Commissioner Lee? Okay. So I don't know if we have any kind of consensus around how to approach these this question procedurally and substantively with what's before us. What I hear amongst my commissioners is a desire to address the increments, but not necessarily to go to the 100 and 500,000 that has been proposed by staff. But oh, I know.
Well, I was going to say, thank you. I would suggest, Madam Chairwoman, public commentary.
Oh, yes, I am anxious to have public comment as well. I'm trying to recap where we are with regard to the discussion that we've had so far. And so, seeing as how we have some concerns and have had some back and forth with staff, I would like to invite the public now to share their views on the various approaches that are laid before us.
I did want to take you back to basics, and that is that it takes a supermajority of the commission to pass. That's 4 votes. So whenever you've got something you're dealing with, you want to always think in terms of 4 votes and a supermajority of the Board of Supervisors as well to modify a voter-passed initiative. If it's a simple change based on empirical data that's come in, for instance, Commissioner Smith asked a minute ago, is it difficult to make a change or correction if we find later that there's a problem with the amendment that we made? It's not a problem generally. It's only the controversial stuff that's going to basically trip you up with supermajority. I do want to also say, though, there's another very, very important provision in the law, and that is that it has to further the purposes of the act. Now, you're all lawyers mostly, and you can understand what that means because I'm sure in law school you debated how some of that could be interpreted. It was made originally a recommendation by Bob Stern, and the person who wrote the Political Reform Act in California for Jerry Brown back in '74, I believe. And it is the basis, the mother of all legislation that pertains to your mandates, essentially. And Bob said, we want to set up a mechanism that you can amend a voter pass initiative, but we don't want a voter pass initiative to be debased. So consequently, whatever amendment is made, it has to pass a test, and that is to further the purposes of the act. Now, your bylaws do not require you to issue findings to demonstrate to the public how your action or your proposed action furthers the purpose of the act. But just know that's really what must be met. That standard must be met. And it makes sense. The voters don't intend for you to dismantle a reform. And that reform has been hard won and tested in the courts up until 2000 when we passed Prop O. Judge Wilkin, Claudia Wilkin, recommended the changes we see now today with public financing in a footnote in her Brown decision, and that's the Brown versus City and County of San Francisco, which undid the CFRO. So reenacted it, and that provision is to further the purpose of the act is to safeguard the voter interest in the matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon again, Chair Chu and Commissioners. Staff, can I ask a favor? Could you pass around my letter to the Commissioners? I emailed it a couple hours before the meeting. Did they have it? Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. It's on the table. Great. So I want, John Gollinger again, I want to focus my comments on some specifics. First, I would say, I'm gratified that it sounds like the majority of the Commission recognized that eliminating the spending limits is not the approach, so I'm not going to spend time on that. I would challenge the premise, I hope, that the intent of this is to make it easier for candidates to figure things out. The compliance burden, I recognize it's not an invalid concern, but I hope the real intent here is to make the system better and to make public financing more meaningful and to make the impact of dirty money and dark money in politics less meaningful. And so I think that as one example, opening it up while more simple to unlimited spending, while that is certainly easy, it would have made it far less valuable to have public money. Similarly, I do think an item that what you've been focusing on in my letter, I encourage you to move forward with attachment 2 in any form, whether the form that's proposed with the larger increments or, as I say in my letter and others have suggested, in smaller increments. I suggest $50,000 for soups and $250 for the mayor, but I think it's more important to modify that system. $50,000 instead of $10,000 is a 5 times improvement on the current system. As someone who's run those kind of campaigns, that would make a huge impact. The larger increment would potentially make a bigger one, but I think in any event, that change will be beneficial, and I would encourage you to move that forward today rather than spin your wheels for next time. I also want to point you to...
Mr. Gollinger, I have a question. So we've been talking numbers, 10,000, 30,000, 50, 100. So as a campaign manager, can you tell me what is the difference between 30, 50, 100? And does it make a difference that if you would have had your candidate's expenditure limit raised 16 versus 12 versus 7 times?
The number of times it's raised is really irrelevant. That's only relevant mostly to people who are outside observers wondering what's going on. For those of us who do this work, we want to know what our spending limit is. So it's only relevant in if it's being raised every single day. I have to check my email for a letter from Pat or whoever the person is sending it to the campaign. I ran Jane Kim's campaign for mayor last year, and in the last few weeks, our spending limit was raised virtually every day. So knowing how much we could spend is important, but otherwise, the relevance to your question is how much we can spend determines what we can do. So the supervisor race is more apt because that's really where $10,000 is so low. What I could do with $10,000 is do barely one mailer to my district if I were running a supervisor campaign. What I could do with $30,000 is do a couple of mailers, hire a handful of people to knock on doors for more than a couple days, and up and up. So it's really the smaller amount limits what you can do with it. More important, I think if you had other campaign manager types here, they would say it's the timeliness of it that's actually more important. So the proposal in attachment 2, not just to raise the increment, but to do it when any amount over the spending limit is increased, as was discussed. To me, that's the most meaningful change because that will front load when the spending limit goes up and therefore allow me to hire people for weeks to knock on doors rather than for 3 days or a week at the end. Okay. I hope that's helpful.
I'd like to move more time for Mr. Gollinger because I have a follow-up question for you.
And I think I'm happy to answer your question. I wanted to talk about the other item I raised in my letter, which is the Catch-22 loophole that's not addressed in staff's proposal. But answer the question first.
Which proposal?
It's the item 3 in my letter. I'm calling it the
I don't have your letter.
Oh, I thought I passed it. I thought it was passed. It's the well, do you want me to speak to that now, Chair, or wait?
Yeah.
Just what is it?
Sure. What it is under the current system, a candidate who's benefiting from independent expenditures is currently given the benefit of a spending increase as well. When the person they're running against spends more money to keep up with those IEs, and that is a have your cake and eat it too situation, or catch-22, I would describe it. So to me, that's a loophole that should be fixed either now or soon. Do you have a question for me?
Yeah, so my question was, so the change in terms of allowing, getting the benefit of the increase earlier is better.
Yes.
But again, because we've heard so much about 30,000 versus 50 versus 100 and the concern that Commissioner Lee expressed, does the 50 versus the 100, does that make a difference to you?
I mean, I'm going to speak for myself.
Because the limit is different from the funds, right?
The limit is different from the funds. From my perspective, and I differ with some of the other advocates, I think are arguing for a lower level, and I'm fine with a lower level, but the higher the amount, to your point, the higher the potential, especially if the match ratio is increased later, the higher the potential funds I can raise for my candidate to do more things to counter the dark money that's flowing in. And I would think of it as a raising, my potential floor as a grassroots community center candidate. The higher that increment, the higher my floor. The higher,
you have, put another way, you have more headroom.
You have more headroom.
Right, so what I'm trying to understand is why the opposition to 100? I'm not sure.
I do think there's an instinctual, and I share this as an advocate. More money in our system is not,
of course,
not what we want, and I think that's in part what's informing it. It's also, as was suggested, we haven't tried this yet, and I don't think it's a bad approach to go with maybe a more moderate version of attachment 2, whether it's 50,000 or number, and then come back. I don't think it will take a year to fix that. I think the biggest sticking point here was the releasing entirely of the limit. If that's been our big issue. But I do share the concern, and I think it's important that grassroots candidates are who we're thinking about, because that's who the public funding system really is supposed to encourage to participate. So I respect that very much.
Thank you.
So I only will say I put language on the back that really. Of my letter that broke out what I think are the 3 scenarios under which you would raise an IEC, because I really think breaking it down rather than having it mushed in 1 or 2 sentences is more meaningful. The 3 scenarios, as I see them, are 1, when there's opposition spending against you specifically, you the candidate, then you would get a spending increase. Number 2, when another candidate is benefiting from outside money, and going over their limit. And number 3, when, as was the case in District 2, which is relatively rare but occurs, there's one candidate or more that don't take the spending limit and spend their own money, and they're the big spenders. Those are the 3 scenarios, and I think it's valuable to break that down when we're thinking about how the trigger and the increase impacts candidates.
So you said something in your very first comment at your first scenario. You're talking about expenditures. So do you have a view on whether we should count expenditures versus contributions?
On that item, I would say I'm a little more agnostic than have a strong opinion. I would prefer to keep the system as is on that count, as long as we're making this other change. I think that's this one. The increment and closing this loophole are more meaningful. However, I don't feel strongly that.
Certainly we would continue to require the reporting of both contributions and expenditures, but just because they're contributions doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be spent. Because I believe most candidates still had some of their funds available at the end.
Yeah, I think the concern that I do share is if the big money candidates. By only, there are bigger money candidates who raise a bunch of money and stick it in a pot. And if the current system says if a candidate raises a lot of money, the other candidate gets to raise and spend more money to keep up, even if the first candidate hasn't spent it. Your proposed change would say they can keep that big war chest on hold, and only when they actually start spending it do the other candidates get to keep up. So that does present a scenario where a candidate A hoards a bunch of money in their contribution account until the last 2-3 weeks and spends it on a TV ad blitz, and the other candidates suddenly can raise and spend more, but then they have to go raise that extra money.
But from a reporting standpoint, they would still have visibility into those.
Yeah, I think that the issue raised about disclosure is not really the concern. It's more how it will affect the campaigns.
Thank you.
Thank you.
afternoon, Chair Chu and Commissioners. I'm Shannon Geis, a San Francisco resident and volunteer with the California Clean Money Campaign. Here's a brief statement from Clean Money. The California Clean Money Campaign, which has over 15,000 supporters in San Francisco, strongly opposes the amendments in Attachment 1. One of the reasons for the matching funds system is because it limits the amount of private money that participating candidates can raise. Completely eliminating the ceiling at the first moment independent expenditures exceed them would kill the ceiling in most competitive races, making them nothing more than a speed bump for special interests. So I think that kind of addresses Commissioner Lee's question that it addresses kind of, sorry. We've seen the negative impact of that approach in Los Angeles, where I guess San Francisco is the only city maybe that has these limits still or something like that. I don't know. Sorry. Where incumbents and other big money candidates essentially have no fundraising limit in competitive races. Because of that, despite taking matching funds, Eric Garcetti spent over $5.3 million in his 2013 race, 137% over LA's initial ceiling. So basically, it didn't slow him down at all. And in San Francisco, on the other hand, London Breed was limited to only 53% over the initial limit due to its incremental approach. So Attachment 2's amendments to instead increase the increments that expenditure limits are more reasonable, but they're too high. An increment of $100,000 in a supervisor's race is a massive 40% increase. Why should one candidate getting a mere $1,000 independent expenditure let others raise an additional $100,000? A 25 increment or at most a 50,000 increment is much more reasonable. And a 500,000 and a mayoral is too much. 250 is better. Anyway, so please support Attachment 2 with lower increments. Thank you so much for your service.
Thank you. Other public comment?
Might I ask a question? And if there
Yes, Commissioner Smith. Oh.
My name is Esther Marks, and I'm a volunteer. I've been a volunteer treasurer for two public finance supervisorial campaigns, one in 2016 and a second in 2018. I also am very happy to hear that most of you do agree that the expenditure limit should not be eliminated. I do recommend if you do adopt increasing the support funds in increments, that it be no more than 50,000 for the supervisor race and no more than 250,000 in the mayor's race. I also do want to comment about making the determination of supportive funds of changing it from contributions, which it is now, to expenditures. In terms of what's important for educating voters is letting them know how much money, and it would be more important for a community campaign, how much dark money is out there waiting to be spent. And I think Mr. Ford would agree that most independent expenditure funds are not, don't have large balances after the campaign. So it's going to be spent. So what is important is for the community candidate, for example, to be able to say to voters and to supporters, this, like $700,000 is going to be spent against me to prop up their candidate. That is very important information to voters. And I can't emphasize that enough. And therefore, I strongly emphasize that the determination of supportive funds should remain contributions and not expenditures. Also, if you do make the decision to increase the initial expenditure limit, I look forward to discussing that in part 2, because from my perspective, any increase in the initial expenditure amount should be equivalent to public monies made available.
Thank you.
If I could provide one point of clarification for the commission. None of the ordinances that are before you would change the calculation of total supported funds when it comes to IE committees. We would not look at, we don't currently look at contributions by IE committees. That's already based on spending. So there would be no change there. This is only for candidate committees. We'd be changing from contributions to expenditures if you were to adopt this approach.
Thank you.
Hi, Commissioners. Once again, my name is Edward Wright. In addition to working as a legislative aide for Supervisor Gordon Marr, I did manage his publicly financed campaign for supervisor, and before that served on the finance team for a campaign for mayor. So through those experiences, in addition to now working in his office, I do have some additional thoughts that I'd like to share about the proposals before you today. I'm happy to hear, and Supervisor Marr is as well, that the Commission, or most of the Commissioners, are not considering removing the IEC entirely once it's been initially broken. Well, we have concerns about that. In addition, as you may have noted in the proposal we sent to you earlier, we agree with the idea of increasing the incremental amount that the IEC may be raised by. We proposed a lower amount than $100,000. I do think the way that a $100,000 increase to the IEC would play out in a race, for instance, for a grassroots candidate, might have unintended consequences than the goals that the ethics staff is seeking to pursue here. So we would prefer to start with a lower amount, and then we could see how that impacts the number of adjustments that need to be made to the IEC over the course of 1 or 2 electoral cycles, and then perhaps could look at making further adjustments to it as needed.
Could you, Mr. Wright, could you elaborate a little bit on what unintended consequences you see?
So, for instance, in the District 4 race, our IEC for Supervisor Marr's campaign was much, much higher than our primary opponent's was, Mrs. Ho. And that was due to the large amount of independent expenditure spending on her behalf. So whether our ceiling was raised by $10,000 or $100,000, and more often it was raised in increments greater than $10,000 due to the outside spending on her behalf, would not have made a meaningful difference for us because the ceiling was already so far above what we were reasonably able to raise as a grassroots publicly financed campaign. However, if we raised up to her ceiling and her ceiling was then raised in an increment of $100,000, I do think that would have made a meaningful difference in her ability to raise even more than what she was already benefiting from in independent expenditure amounts. So that's where I think some of our concern is coming from as we look at the exact increment that might be appropriate. We proposed $30,000. We're very open to considering numbers different than $30,000. But that was just sort of our initial proposal, and we'd be happy to work with the ethics staff on an analysis of what different amounts might end up resulting in terms of how they could play out in the number of incremental adjustments made. I did also just want to comment briefly on...
I'm sorry, I have a question about the incremental adjustments. As a campaign manager, how did that impact you? We heard from Mr. Gollinger, like when you would get these multiple increases on a regular basis.
I would share Mr. Gollinger's comments that the number of increases was not the most important to us. It was about the funds available to us. And again, noting as the more grassroots campaign in that race, our ceiling was already set so high based on the amount of independent expenditures spent against us that whether it was raised by $10,000 or $100,000 wouldn't have really made a material difference for us. However, if it were increased by an increment of $100,000, we think for our opponent that probably would have made a material difference.
Thank you.
And then I did just want to comment briefly on the proposed modifications for how total supportive funds are calculated. And to sort of echo the concerns raised by Mrs. Marks and Mr. Gollinger, our preference would be that we continue to calculate them based on total contributions rather than expenditures. The reason being that increasing the IEC for a grassroots campaign, part of what is helpful there is if it can be responsive to what's happening on the ground in the campaign. And while disclosures are required for expenditures, there can be a delay in when those come through, or when receipts are posted versus when a mailer hits or a TV ad goes out. And just the longer that delay is between when something might impact the campaign and when the IEC is raised, the harder that is for a grassroots candidate to keep up. So our preference would be that we keep the existing calculation mechanism based on contributions.
Thank you.
Could I ask Commissioner Smith? As you all know, this is my first meeting, so I don't have the background that my colleagues or the staff does, but I have done a lot of reading this week, and I've gotten a lot of memos and a lot of feedback from outside advocates and other people. And the number that keeps all of the information I've gotten, except for the staff's initial recommendations, is that in opposition to ending the limits. And the figures that are coming before me, at least, by several different people, and I've heard it today again, is something in the neighborhood of 50 for supervisors, and 250 for the mayor. However, Mr. Ford, I think I heard him right, said the staff would prefer that if that's what we're going to do, they'd prefer we do nothing. Did I hear you correctly, Mr. Ford?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay. And I've also heard from various people high praise indeed for the quality of the staff. And I don't want to get myself on their wrong side, my very first meeting, but I'm puzzled by this difference in view of why the outside view seems to go fairly strongly so far, at least on what I've heard, to something in the neighborhood of 50, 250, and the staff feels that that's worse than not doing anything at all. So I don't know if today's the day to elaborate on that, but if maybe you could send me some more information or make some more information. I know there's a lot of information out there, but I am puzzled by this discrepancy and troubled by it.
I would be glad to provide more information about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. My name's Stephen Hill, and this is not a cooperating microphone. So the first thing I want to say is someone who's been involved in this program now for almost 20 years, it's hard for me to imagine that it's been that long, that this is a successful program. There might be some complaints about it. There's always been complaints about it from candidates and some people who miss a deadline and, they blame it on their treasurer or whomever. But by and large, we have had this program for nearly 20 years, and dozens of candidates have received funding from this program. And a lot of those were candidates that wouldn't have been competitive without public financing. And so, of course, we should always look at anything that's making it harder, try to make it easier. But whenever you're designing public policy, you're in the realm of trying to find that sweet spot of balancing values. And so on the one hand, to me, the overwhelming goal of public financing is to have candidates out there and running, and we have had that. Now, if there are problems with staff being able to administer that, I'm sympathetic to that. I was the person that got 15% of the public financing money to go to the Ethics Commission to administer this program. And if we need to raise that to 16% so staff can do the job, I've suggested let's do that. But when I hear that we have to encourage more candidates, or that somehow candidates are finding this so hard to deal with that maybe they're not running, I just fundamentally disagree with that. This is not a program that has huge amounts of problems that need to be fixed in this way. When you're giving public money to candidates, there needs to be accountability. There needs to be rules, and they have to agree to abide by those rules, and the staff have to administer those rules. And thinking that somehow the rules are so out of whack
that people are not running or that this has become too burdensome of a program, I just fundamentally disagree with that. And so, you know, if we need to change it, okay, I'm open to negotiation and compromise, and I think we're slowly getting there. But at this point, it's been many months on this process. And so what I'm hoping that the Ethics Commission can do today is to agree to send to the Board of Supervisors at least a couple of things. One is leaving the incremental increase in the IEC. We've talked about 50,000 versus 100,000. Frankly, we don't know where the board will be in this, so it doesn't, I prefer 50. I think you could do it at 100,000 and it'll be okay. You can send that over to the Board of Supervisors. Let's see what they think about it so we can move the process forward. And also changing the deadline for filing the statement of participation to 3 days after the deadline. Everyone agrees on that. What I don't think you should send over is changing contributions, tracking by contributions to expenditures. This is bad policy. For all the reasons that have already been discussed, it will lead to candidates holding back their money. It will, because as a result, the IEC of their opponent will go up more slowly, and they can hold that money back. And then when they're ready to just throw it all into the race, only then will the IEC of the opponent go up in response to that expenditure. But at that point, it's too late for the candidate to raise the money because it's already being spent and it's fast and furious in a campaign. So tracking it by contributions is the way to do it. It's the way we've always done it here. And that's the other thing I want to say is I'm rather conservative about this. You change only what you need to change to make it better. Don't go fishing for things that aren't broken. And the part of changing contributions to expenditures was part of the package of getting rid of the IEC entirely. If we're not going to do that anymore, there's much less rationale for changing from contributions to expenditures.
Commissioner Kopp.
Yeah, Mr. Hill.
Yes.
Thank you again for your time and attention to rectifying that error from 15 years ago. And then secondly, I want to say that you, on February 14th, distributed, at least to me, I'd infer to other members of the commission, your next step recommendations.
Yes.
And I would adopt both of them. To change the individual expenditure limit by 50,000 for supervisors and 250,000 for mayoral candidates, and extend the deadline for participating in writing to 3 days. And that would, I think, satisfy complaints that I've heard in the last 2 years I've been on the commission.
Sounds like a good proposal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
May I ask him a question?
Yes.
I'm not sure you spoke to the other nuance, which is that the cap would be increased once the limit was exceeded by any amount. I did hear Mr. Gollinger say that was, and I believe the supervisor's aide, that was a significant change, that once that threshold was reached, it would be increased, quote, by any amount in the legislation. Are you in support of that?
Yes, that's the right trigger to have.
Okay, all right, thanks. I just wanted to get that on my checklist.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other public comment? No. Okay. So I would propose a motion then to take up the two items. The first would be to, I don't think it's in here, Pat, but it would be to change the date of filing from 3 days after the date of the candidate. Let me back up. That the change that we're proposing that we ran into as a result of challenges from the District 4 race this summer, that we would move the date of the notice of intent to participate in the public finance program to occur 3 days from and after the date of the deadline for filing candidacy papers. Is that right?
Yeah, I would second such a motion.
So that would be the first component. And then the second component of the motion would be to change the increments in the supervisorial race and the mayor races to raise the independent expenditure ceilings by 50,000 and 250,000. And I, like my fellow commissioners, both received written comment as well as hearing today in public comment. And the comment that resonated the most with me was from Mr. Wright, because I heard a lot of like 50,000's too high, 100,000's too high, but I didn't really hear why. But from a grassroots candidate perspective, he said that the concern would be that if they're well-funded, i.e. supported candidate, if that limit would go up by 100,000, it's a significant hurdle, right? Which is different from 50. And so, to me, that is that would be a reason for rationing back from 100,000 to 50,000. So I would propose that we vote today on a $50,000 incremental increase for the supervisors and 250,000 in mayoral races.
I second that as a motion.
And can I add that the trigger would be the language that the staff presented to us by any amount? So that would be the ceiling would be lifted if the, I don't want to read all this language, but anyway, if the sum of the formula for the cap is greater than, in the case of the mayor, we are saying 250,000, it's by any amount, right?
Yes. So as Mr. Ford had explained, that once the amount is reached by the $1, then the cap would go up. If there's a more elegant way to say it, Pat, I'm sure you could provide that.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I'm assuming that you are not including, purposefully not including the change from contributions to expenditures in your motion at this time. Okay, thank you.
All right. Any amendments to the motion?
Well, I wouldn't second a motion that changed it from contributions.
Okay.
For the reasons just stated by Mr. Hill, and they're stated in some of the papers I've received on this subject.
So the motion would be to change the filing date for 3 days, and then to change the supervisor and mayoral increase amounts from 10,000 and to 50,000 and 100,000. And to make sure that the mechanism is as outlined in the proposed ordinance that Mr. Ford provided.
Right, and then finally, we haven't focused on it, but I don't think there was opposition to the language that you drafted concerning eliminating the unnecessary trust account. If we can forward that, I think there's no concern about that.
Yeah, so I believe Commissioner Ambrose is proposing an amendment to include a motion to eliminate the trust account.
Specifically, it's the staff proposed amendments to sections 1.104, the definition, and 1.108, the candidate committee campaign contribution trust account language.
Just to clarify, it's the contingency account.
I'm sorry,
That would
yes,
no longer
the
be a requirement.
yes, the contingency account. Misspoke.
Thank you.
I am unclear. Is that a third motion?
Yes.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
I would ask for a vote separately on each of the three motions.
Okay.
Yeah, no, if I could just clarify so we can make sure we're stating the motion correctly. There were two pieces that Commissioner Chu, Chair Chu initially mentioned. One is to change the notice of intent to participate to 3 days after the filing. That was seconded by Commissioner Kopp. I believe Commissioner Chu, then Chair Chu, was also adding the increments for the Board of Supervisors to 50,000 and 250,000 in the mayor's races, the new incremental adjustment. That was echoed by Commissioner Kopp as a second as well. My understanding was that was the building of one motion, and I just wanted to clarify if there are going to be four distinct motions, or if it was the chair's preference to have one motion and they were just enumerating the pieces of the motion.
I was enumerating the pieces of the motion, but we can vote on them separately.
Okay, so then if we have three separate questions, the third would be Commissioner Ambrose's clarification that there is also a, adding the ceiling is lifted if the sum is exceeded by $1, that provision. And then the fourth would be to proceed with eliminating the contingency account. Have I stated those four elements correctly in your view?
Yes, in my view, yes.
No, you're right. That's correct. That's correct, yeah. Yeah, keep that the same.
Do we now have four seconded motions, or do we have one motion with four subparts to it? I mean, procedurally, I think we need to clarify.
I think procedurally, it sounds like the intent was, based on the conversation, to have four separate actions with each of these elements, since Commissioner Kopp asked for a separate vote on each item. Is that your understanding?
Well, so, okay. So just to clarify, in terms of the motions, if they all or some prove to be successful, I just would appreciate a little bit of clarity on what would be the next step. So would you want us to have a motion incorporating whatever amendments are approved, draft new legislation, and come back to the commission next month, or to go ahead and forward to the Board of Supervisors?
No.
I'm just asking because the sum total of the amendments or motions being proposed aren't reflected in attachments 1, 2, or 3. So I just want to be clear about what the next step would be.
Well, I would suggest that we approve the motions and that a new ordinance be drafted, and that it would incorporate those components that are already been drafted, but put them into a new document, integrating them all into one, and that we would then transmit that over to the Board of Supervisors.
Okay.
But just to be clear, so assuming that any one of these items receives the requisite 4 votes, that would be included in the we're not going to bring the ordinance back in front of the commission at the next meeting, right? If we have support for, if we have 4 votes in favor of any one of these items, that legislation could be written and forwarded, or do you want it to come back for another hearing?
No, I wasn't, it would not, my view is that I don't think it would need to come back to us next month for another hearing before sending it to the Board of Supervisors. Is that, if that's your question?
Yes,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure we're giving direction to them to put this in ordinance form and forward it to the board
Right.
if it receives 4 votes.
And procedurally, I don't see any issue with that. I just wanted clarity about what the next step would be in terms of whatever was approved by the commission tonight.
All right.
That was it.
For clarification, where does that leave the question of contributions versus expenditures?
My understanding is that none of the commissioners
Pardon?
moved to make that change.
Okay,
So it would stay as the status quo, which
Okay.
tracks contribution.
all right.
So, Dr. Pelham, could you please recap the first
I've got to
motion?
leave in about 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, so the,
Suggest calling the roll.
yes, why don't we take the vote on the 4 separate motions?
So, all right, so with the first motion is on the notice of the intent to participate, to move it to 3 days after the filing deadline. We'll take a roll call. Commissioner Ambrose?
That's the first.
That is the first, yes, that is the first we're taking a roll call vote on. Commissioner Ambrose?
Aye.
Commissioner Smith?
Aye.
Chair Chu?
Aye.
Commissioner Kopp?
Aye.
And Commissioner Lee?
Aye.
Okay, that motion passes 5-0. The second motion would be to change the increments for the incrementally adjusted individual expenditure ceilings to $50,000 for Board of Supervisors and to $250,000 for candidates for mayor. So for that, on that particular motion, Commissioner Ambrose?
Aye.
Commissioner Smith?
Aye.
Commissioner Chu?
Aye.
Commissioner Kopp?
Aye.
And Commissioner Lee?
Aye.
Thank you. So that also passes 5-0. The third is the concept of adding the, adjusting the ceiling if the sum of the expenditure stuff, no, contribution stuff, goes up by $1. That is not the language we'd really want reflected in the motion, but Pat, do you want to take a stab at summarizing that briefly?
Right. It would be to carry out an adjustment to the IEC, to the spending limit, when the formula, the sum of total supported funds and total opposition against the opposition spending against the candidate exceeds the candidate's current spending limit by any amount, and not to wait until it exceeds it by one full increment.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for that clarification. On that, Commissioner Lee?
Aye.
Commissioner Kopp?
Aye.
Commissioner Chu?
Aye.
Commissioner Smith?
Aye.
And Commissioner Ambrose?
Aye.
Thank you. That 5-0, that also passes. And then the last would be to continue with the elimination of the contingency account.
And to be clear, I didn't get a second on that motion, so before we put it to a vote, somebody.
There's a second from Commissioner Lee.
Okay.
The second was, so the motion has been made and
Okay,
seconded.
great.
So Commissioner Lee?
Aye.
Commissioner Kopp?
No.
Commissioner Chu?
Yes. Aye.
Commissioner Smith?
Aye.
And Commissioner Ambrose?
Aye.
So that motion passes on a 4-1 vote, with Commissioner Kopp in the dissent. Thank you.
So then next steps will be for staff to prepare, to incorporate all of these ordinances into, provisions into a single ordinance and then transmit that over to the Board of Supervisors.
That's correct.
Okay. Great. All right. So I would propose a 10-minute break. We regroup and then come back for the balance of the agenda.
Make sure we don't miss anything.
SF Gov TV, San Francisco Government Television.
don't mean.
Oh, are they not on? Do I have to gavel in again? Okay. So welcome back to the San Francisco Ethics Commission meeting. We are now on agenda item number 9, which is discussion of the monthly staff policy report.
This presentation.
Thank you, Chair Chu. Item 9 is staff's monthly policy report. It's fairly brief, so I will not go through it and just make myself available for any questions that you might have. But you will see that the review of the public financing program is on here, and then a couple of other items.
The only question I have is the Form 700 filing deadline. That is April 2nd.
Correct.
Okay. And then the Ethics Commission and Sunshine filings are due on April 1st.
It's either the first or second.
First or second. Okay, so we all have to update our filings shortly.
I'm sure the staff will be reminded.
But you'll be reminding us, right?
Yeah, I think the Engagement and Compliance Division can help you with that.
Okay. Okay. Commissioners, any questions for Pat on the policy report? Public comment on agenda item number 9? There being none. Okay, agenda item number 10, discussion of monthly staff enforcement report, including an update on various programmatic and operational highlights of the enforcement program's activities since the last monthly meeting.
Thank you, Chair Chu and Commissioners. We have again this month at Commissioner Kopp's request provided for you statistics related to matters that are both in preliminary review and in open investigation as compared to those statistics this time last month and this time a year ago. I just want to know quickly that I reversed how I present those so that you read them oldest from left, newest to right. So you can see that we're more or less maintaining a kind of steady state on those matters. We have roughly the same number of matters in preliminary review as we had a month ago. The amount of time it takes us to get through those has come up slightly, but the number of matters in open investigation, again, is holding relatively constant, as is the amount of time that it takes investigators, on average, to get through those matters. I would say, as we have said previously, that not reflected in these statistics is the amount of work that investigators have undertaken that is still sitting in front of me or still sitting in front of the executive director for subsequent review before those matters can get finalized. So I know that it's hard for you as commissioners or for members of the public to have confidence that the Enforcement Division is working efficiently through these matters if the numbers appear to go up every month or if they remain constant. But the investigators are working ambitiously on the docket, and I do hope that in the coming months these numbers will better reflect what the Enforcement Division has actually accomplished. A brief note on staff training. We do have a couple of things to look forward to coming up. One is that counterparts from the Fair Political Practices Commission will come down from Sacramento at the end of March to provide a half-day training not only to the Enforcement Division, but to all of the Commission staff, specifically on conflicts of interest, and in particular financial conflicts of interest that are enshrined in Article 3 of the Campaign and Governmental Conduct Code. Arguably, these are among the more complex of the kinds of enforcement matters that may come before a commission like ours, both substantively and factually. So our counterparts will provide training in the substance of the law, but also in best investigative practices. Additionally, investigator Jeff Zumwalt, who negotiated the settlement that you approved in item 4 today, discovered that the Federal Inspectors General provides training in the kinds of work that the Enforcement Division conducts. Some of the training that they offer is available only to their own personnel, but some of it is opened up to their counterparts at state and local agencies. And we have chosen a couple of training opportunities that align with goals of the Enforcement Division and that align with the professional development needs of the investigators who will attend those trainings. Availability permitting, as I note in the report, because the federal inspectors general keep all of those positions, all of the training spots open first for their own staff, and then would allow local counterparts in off wait list. So we do hope that our investigators will attend those trainings. A brief note on the Bureau of Delinquent Revenue. As you can see, there's not much movement there in the several cases that the Bureau has been pursuing on behalf of the Ethics Commission. The particular debtors that the Bureau has been working to locate remain at large, if you will. I can report that the Commission's Fines Collection Officer has been undertaking a review of late fee collection efforts that she has made over the course of this fiscal year, and she has identified quite a large list of additional candidates that we can refer over to BDR, and so I should have an update on that in a month or two. The outstanding debt represents between $35,000 and $40,000 within this particular fiscal year.
I'm sorry, Mr. Pierce, that's $35,000 to $40,000 in addition to the $101,000 listed here?
Correct. It's possible that when the fines collection officer sends warning letters to the committees who have yet to pay their late fees, they will pay those fees as opposed to require us to refer them over to BDR. So you may or may not see all of those committees on this list in a future report.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to receive other questions.
Commissioners, any questions for Mr. Pierce? Public comment? Agenda item number 11, discussion of Executive Director's report, an update of various programmatic and operational highlights of Ethics Commission staff activities since the Commission's last monthly meeting.
Good evening, Commissioners. I wanted to highlight several things and then take a slightly deeper dive into one area that I know is of very important interest to the Commission, that's the budget. But first, I wanted to just highlight some of the outreach that's been going on over the past month and that you'll be finding yourselves in the next several weeks as we move into filing season for annual statements of economic interest and Form 700 filings and ethics training. First, our office partnered with the City Attorney's Office and the Management Employee Association over the course of January to provide 5 sessions for city managers to be a refresher on tools and resources they have to monitor ethics issues and to know where to turn with questions. And we had about 80 city managers participating in these sessions. We also had DCA Shen helping to guide them through often commonly asked conflicts questions. These were very well received, and we're excited about the possibility to continue that partnership down the road. We know that it's very helpful, and that managers are really hungry for knowing what kind of assistance is available to them as they navigate ethical issues that might come up in their department. So we were happy to do that and appreciate MEA's and City Attorney's role in that. We have, over the last month, also been working to prepare materials for the annual filing process. To Chair Chu's question a moment ago, because the annual April 1st filing deadline for statements of economic interest falls on Cesar Chavez Day for the state of California, the FPPC this year, then just this year, for only this year, has the deadline of April 2nd. So we're notifying all departments and working with filing officers to make that happen. There's a bit of a hiccup in that our ethics and sunshine training is still due April 1st. But we will, again, communicate that to all affected filers so that we know we can get those statements in on time and provide assistance that we need to. So we expect to be getting much more information out in the next couple of weeks on that front.
Dr. Pallin, will there be more Form 700 filers doing it electronically? Because I know that was one of the projects that Stephen Massey was undertaking, and I'm just wondering if that is going to be available for filers in this cycle?
That is not going to be available this cycle. There are some resource constraints that have not allowed us to move forward on that, but we anticipate, I think, later this spring having a regulation to help achieve that. Our target at this point looks like having it implemented for the April 2020 filings, if I'm correct. But we'll come back with you with more information on that. We know that it's not being in place this year.
Great, thank you.
It's a priority to continue to do that for all designated filers in the city. I also just would note that we are having, we started information sessions for the departmental filing officers over the last week, and we're continuing over this month and into March with information sessions directly for designated filers in departments so that we can provide them with direct assistance about what the filing obligations are, why they exist, and how they can access tools and resources to support them in that process. You may be curious about news on our hiring. As you may know, and for the benefit of our newest commissioner, Commissioner Smith, we've had a very ambitious hiring plan underway over the last number of months. I am very, very happy to say that over this past month, we've concluded the oral interview phase for each position. I'm even more happy to announce that we have 3 positions that are now I can publicly announce are filled, will be filled shortly.
Congratulations.
And we look forward to introducing those new staff, those new roles to you at the next month's meeting. In short order, Amy Lee, who has been a lead supervisor on our audit program, will become our new principal manager, principal program manager for audits. Jeff Zumwalt, who has been working with the enforcement team as an investigator, will now be our senior investigator, one of our senior investigators. And so that's terrific for both of our staff to be seeing these new responsibilities. We're excited about that. And thirdly, we have somebody who is currently a member of the city family, but is moving to a new role to be working with Pat Ford and all of us in our policy group. We look forward to introducing a new policy analyst to you next month as well. Brian Cox has been in the public defender's office doing legal work, and he also has experience from his days in New Orleans working with in the U.S. Attorney's Office. He's an undergrad from Yale and a graduate of the Tulane Law School. So we will have some more lawyers on staff, but very excited about the team and bringing forward more work and bigger volume for you in the months to come. And I'll have hope to have more news next month about the remaining positions.
Wonderful. Well, please extend my congratulations to Amy Lee and Jeff Zumwalt on their promotions. That's wonderful for their to have the opportunity to take on more responsibility, and also in the case of Amy to take on a management role. That's really terrific. And congratulations, Pat, on getting some much needed help. Look forward to meeting our newest policy analyst at the next meeting. That's great news. It's been a long time coming.
Now you can sleep.
Yeah. No, none of that. And just in terms of the budget, as you'll know from my last the report this month and my report last month, the budgets for departments are due February 21st, next week. So we will, as soon as we've submitted a budget, provide copies to you all that provide the detailed requests that we've made. As you know, the budget priorities that the mayor has articulated in the budget instructions this year are actually quite similar to the commission's ongoing priorities, ensuring accountability for the services that we provide and the programs that we undertake, and promoting equitable outcomes throughout the city. We really want to broaden the impact of our work citywide. It's encouraging to see people engaging us on these issues, as sometimes lengthy as it can be. We know there are a lot of areas we're not reaching yet, so we really want to do that as best we can with limited resources. We do that by leveraging our staff as much as possible, but also through technology. The presentation that you saw from Tyler Field earlier today is exactly the kind of information we want to make sure we can help equip the public with. It doesn't come with just technology. It comes with going out and actually meeting with individuals and organizations about that information and how they can access it, and learning from listening what it is that people want from information and how they need it and the ways that they need it. So we are going to be aggressively looking for additional resources in this budget to ensure we can continue on with some needed technology to continue that kind of work, but also importantly to expand it with a focus on improving and continuing to deepen our public engagement. Whether it's in the policy arena or in public disclosure, we want our public disclosure to be meaningful and to be a tool for the public, understanding the role of money in politics in city government. The instructions that the mayors provided also are to identify targeted cuts. I mentioned those last month. And I can say that we will not be proposing reductions. We will be identifying, if we were to face those cuts, what the impact would be to our programs. And inevitably, there will be an impact for staffing resources, whether in the ability to retain staff and the positions that we've fought hard to get, or whether in the tools that we allow staff to have to use to do the job that we are asking of them. So we've been in some very constructive conversations with the mayor's budget office to date to just understand sort of, what they're looking for, and for them to see how committed we are to doing the best we can with what we have, but also to continue to demonstrate the need that we have to do this work. It continues only to broaden and to deepen, and we want to be able to do that work effectively, and we all, as you know, are committed to doing it as effectively and efficiently as possible. So we're excited about the coming budget cycle, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can at this point. We're still analyzing some data and putting those documents together, and we'll have them submitted next Thursday as required. But we are very much focused on strengthening the services and programs that we have so that we can really broaden the impact of the programs in our work citywide. So I look forward to answering any questions that you might have at this point, and certainly to providing a deeper overview of the information at your next month's meeting as we start more in earnest in those budget discussions.
So thank you for that, Director Pelham. It seems like the budgeting process takes up more and more time every year. But I would like to say, if I can help in any way in terms of having conversations with City Hall to emphasize how important it is that we maintain our funding, simply because this has been, I think, a 2 or 3 year effort now in order to adequately resource the commission and right-size, upsize, I think, if the word is to be used accurately, to provide the staffing levels needed to provide the level of service and the kind of dashboarding that we just saw today, which I think is an incredibly powerful tool that we only need more of, and to think that we would have to cut staff because we have no program revenues that we can, program dollars to be able to cut. It would only be people that would necessarily impact in a, I think, a material and significant way our ability to deliver for the people of San Francisco. So anything that we can do to help prevent that from happening, I'm there to do. And I don't know if this is work that you've undertaken already, or if it's in the city government context, is that useful? But in the corporate world, benchmarking was always very well received. So if we looked at Oakland, or Los Angeles is a much larger jurisdiction, but Richmond, for example, like how large are their staff? What is their budget? And how do we compare in terms of the total amount of resources available for the programs that are being administered, if that would be helpful to and compelling, in any way, that it shows that we're grossly understaffed or underfunded, and we need a lot more. I remember Pat and I were talking last week where New York has an enforcement division of tens.
I think we were talking about their auditors.
Auditors,
if I remember correctly, and I want to say that they have over 20, maybe 25.
20 auditors, and the overall staff of the commission is 24. Right. So it really definitely impacts in terms of the workload that Mr. Pierce has, how many investigators you can put against that body of work. So onwards and upwards. Anyone? Any other comments or questions from commissioners?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Public comment.
I just wanted to also join in congratulating the staff for their promotions. And as these hires take place, I assume you're creating vacancies in audit and investigative staffs. And are they going to be lapsed in order to create some budget savings? That's the question I had. Or whether you plan to move quickly ahead to hire. You'll go quickly. Very good. Well, there's got to be a mazel tov, a phrase, mazel tov.
Thank you. Okay. Agenda item number 12, discussion and possible action regarding the status of complaints received or initiated by the Ethics Commission. Possible closed session. Is there a motion to go into closed session? No. Okay. Any public comment on agenda item number 12? No. Okay. Agenda item number 13, discussion and possible action on items for future meetings. Anyone have anything? Director Bellum.
We did want to announce that the April 19th meeting, that is a regularly scheduled meeting because of the Passover holiday that begins that day, as well as other conflicting schedules, are now moving the commission, have moved the commission meeting to the week prior. So April the 12th, Friday at 1:30. We will put a notice on our website and make sure the public is aware of that so people can plan accordingly. So thank you for your flexibility.
Could you send an email to all of us on the commission just to remind us to update our calendars? Yes, I believe it's Good Friday and the start of Passover, so it's...
Did you say 1:30, Leanne? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Public comment on agenda item number 13? I see Mr. Marsteller is putting his jacket on, so no. Agenda item 14, additional opportunity for public comment on matters appearing or not appearing on the agenda pursuant to Ethics Commission Bylaws, Article 7, Section 2.
Actually, I did have a comment, and that was when you promulgate legislation to amend a voter pass initiative, would it be a matter of law to attest that the proposal, in your view, by a vote possibly, meets the requirement to further the purpose of the act? Or is that implied by 4 votes? If you get the votes to approve the matter, then does that imply that it's furthering the purpose of the act? I would say not. We have done things in the past that we should not have done, in my view and the view of others, because this provision was ignored. So I think it's important to verify, and there's a term for that, when you file a motion, you have to, it's verification, I think. You would verify or attest to the fact that it does, in fact, meet the requirements, in this case, to further the purpose of the act. And I only bang the gavel on this so much because I've seen things done that did not further the purpose of the act. And I just thought it was time for us to, now that we're mature and grown up, to deal with this question and maybe codify, perhaps in the bylaws, this concept that we want to verify what it is we're doing here so that the voters have our assurances. And I think that's important.
Thank you. All right. Item 15, is there a motion to adjourn? Second. All right. We're adjourned. Wishing everyone a wonderful long weekend, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.